Hello, everyone. My name is Ken Fisher, and I'm the founder and editor-in-chief of Ars Technica. I, on behalf of Ars, am thrilled to welcome you to our second Ars Frontiers event. Today's theme is Charting Responsible Growth. We will explore the interconnectedness and the challenges therein of topics such as space exploration and climate change, health, medicine, and epidemiology, machine learning and artificial intelligence, and more. While we explore these topics, we have one thing we're really focused on. Can we continue to drive explosive growth and innovation while refocusing our efforts on sustainability and ethical behaviors? But before we dig in, let me say a little bit about how we're structured today. We have 6 panels, each of 30 minutes of length, with 10 minutes left for questions at the end. So please, if you do have a question, use the YouTube chat and drop it in there. Our moderators will scoop them up and we'll hit as many as we can in the time allotted. So let's dive in. To kick us off, we have a discussion on the recent efforts and perhaps even some successes in banning TikTok. This will be hosted by our senior policy reporter, Ashley Bellinger. Away we go.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ashley Belanger, Senior Policy Reporter at Ars Technica. Today, we're talking about the potential TikTok ban. Although Congress is exploring a ban, the reality is that TikTok users almost certainly won't take it seriously, and the app is as popular as ever. So today, we're going to find out, what do the experts say about the situation, and how likely is the ban to actually happen? Before I introduce our guests, a quick reminder to send any questions in the comments section on YouTube, and we'll have time for a brief Q&A at the end. Now for our guests, we have Brian Cunningham, Ioana Literat, and Corinne McSherry. Brian Cunningham is a former White House lawyer and CPRI Executive Director at UCI Cybersecurity Policy and Research Institute. Cunningham is a leading international cybersecurity law and policy expert, a former White House lawyer, advisor, and a media commentator on cybersecurity, technology, and surveillance issues. He was the founding vice chair of the American Bar Association Cybersecurity Privacy Task Force and was awarded the National Intelligence Medal of Achievement. Ioana Literat is an associate professor in the Communication, Media, and Learning Technologies Design program at Teachers College, Columbia University, where she also co-directs the Media and Social Change Lab. Her research explores young people's creative and civic participation on social media, with a particular focus on TikTok as a key platform for youth political expression. Corinne McSherry is the legal director at Electronic Frontier Foundation, specializing in copyright, intermediary liability, and free expression. She has been named one of California's top entertainment lawyers and AmLaw's Litigator of the Week. Her policy work includes leading EFF's efforts to fix copyright, foster innovation, and promote best practices for online expression. Thanks, everyone, for being here today. Now, to kick off the discussion, I'm hoping each of you can weigh in on this first question. What is your opinion on the proposed TikTok ban by Congress? You want to start us off, Ioana?
Sure. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation. So I've been following the platform from a research perspective back since it was Musical.ly. I started my research on TikTok in 2016 and was really able to follow its growth and its recent explosion in popularity. So from where I stand, and of course, I'm really concerned with young people's infatuation with the platform and the role that it plays in young people's lives, it would set a huge precedent. And of course, my co-panelists can talk much better than I can about the legal precedent. But from where I stand, I see it as a huge cultural and political precedent. Banning a platform that is so incredibly popular, really at the apex of its popularity, and a platform that is such a huge part of our cultural sphere, because even if you're not on TikTok, TikTok is shaping the culture you consume today, right? Through the trends, the memes, the content that goes viral on the platform and that seeps into our platform. But in my view, there's two issues that are pretty major. One is that as a social media researcher, I can say that TikTok's data privacy practices aren't necessarily more egregious than those of its competitors. And, an argument that I've made to my work is that we really need better data protection regulations throughout that apply to all platforms. And the second is that the government hasn't really shown a compelling justification for the ban. If you're going to restrict freedom of speech in this way, you really need to make a very clear and potent case for the need for the ban, and really the fact that there's no better alternatives to this ban.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Corinne, could you talk maybe a little bit, well, what is your opinion on the proposed ban, and what do you think will be the legal implications?
Yeah, so I think that it is entirely performative and a complete waste of time. And I think of that for a few different reasons. The first is that there's no way, I've not seen any version of the proposal that passes First Amendment scrutiny. I mean, it won't fly. And sort of, briefly, you do have to pass First Amendment scrutiny, which is what will apply, because it's clearly going to burden speech of people who might want to use it. And also, anyway, it implicates free speech in a number of ways that I think are completely obvious. But to pass muster, given that, the government is going to need to show at a minimum, there's sort of different kinds of scrutiny, but at a minimum, they're going to have to show that it's tailored to a compelling government interest, and that it's sort of there's a close fit between whatever that goal is and an actual ban. And I just don't think there's any way that sort of isolating one particular application and saying we're going to ban this one is going to pass muster. And I think what we've heard is a concern about national security and a concern that TikTok is gathering data about people and then providing it to a foreign government. I think that is basically what I've heard. But we haven't seen a lot of specifics on that. The government really hasn't made much of an effort to get beyond rhetoric in terms of what we should really be worried about. And the thing that I find frustrating about this, perhaps you can hear in my voice, I'm a little frustrated about this, is that if we actually care about data privacy, which I think we should, I think that's really important, what we really need is comprehensive federal legislation that doesn't just target one particular app, but actually, really protects all of us by targeting all of the different ways in which companies are surveilling us all the time. That's a legit concern, and I feel that this focus on banning TikTok is just distracting us from what we actually need to focus on.
Yeah. What about you, Brian? What's your opinion of the ban? I know you come from a cybersecurity and understand the national security issues a little better than maybe all of us here.
Well, I'm going to completely agree with my predecessors and completely disagree with them at the same time, which is a neat trick for a lawyer. Thank you for having us. It's a very timely topic, obviously, and it's great to be here. I think, to directly answer your question, I think Congress and the president will try to ban TikTok, and I think it'll be a complete failure. I think it'll be a complete failure, not only for the reasons that that EFF's representative has said, but also because it's not enforceable. I don't know how you think you're going to get the app off tens of millions of people. I mean, we're going to have border checkpoints where they look at your phone and see if the app is on there. And furthermore, if it somehow was successful, if you could compel Apple and Google to get it off the App Store, other ways would pop up for you to sneak it on anyway. Or I live in Seattle, Washington. I have two daughters, 24 and 22. And if they ban TikTok, I guarantee you they would drive to Vancouver and load it on their app, on their phone, and drive back down here with it. So I think politically, given where we are with the two things that the far right and far left agree on are the threat from China and the threat from social media, I think it's likely that they will try to do something. And I also think it will fail. We can circle back to the national security threats in a minute, though, which are very real. I just happen to think there's better ways to address them.
Yeah. Well, how do you think the data privacy concerns related to TikTok compare to those of other social media platforms such as Facebook and Instagram? Brian, did you have
I
thoughts on
think, yeah. Well, first of all, I think my predecessors were correct, and it's appropriate to try to do more to protect privacy on social media apps. I've been involved in that space for a long time. However, Meta and Google and Apple and others are not run by the Chinese Communist Party. And I think it is a significant possibility that the United States will be in at least an extreme Cold War, if not a shooting war, with China in the next 10 years. And that, to me, makes this threat very different.
Gotcha. Corinne, what do you think about how the data privacy concerns related to TikTok compare to other social media platforms such as Facebook and Instagram? In particular, just gulping up lots of data. I'm just wondering, I've seen it said a lot that that if China wants the data, they're going to find it just because it's being sold. Do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the threats to ordinary users that come from all of the data that's being collected about them and the like is very, very real and very, very serious. But if I'm your average user, I think you should be a lot more concerned about all of the people who are tracking your location all of the time and then selling that information to the highest bidder. It could be China, it could be somebody else, and that's a very real threat. So if I'm a person, for example, who might be seeking reproductive care or providing reproductive care, my immediate anxiety would probably be location data brokers. And that's a real threat right now. It's not a hypothetical one. And that's just the beginning. There's so many different ways in which our information is collected, including by social media companies. And the reality is, if you build it, they will come. By which I mean, once you create this trove of information, you're going to get requests from it. Some of them will be from governments, some of them will be from courts via a subpoena. Can come a lot of different ways, and that's a real present danger to our security. That may implicate our national security, but it certainly implicates our personal security right here and right now. And I think that is where we focus. I will say one other thing, which is, I agree very much that it's also just not enforceable, because what will happen is people will just use VPNs and they will get whatever apps they want anyway. But that actually then creates a different kind of security risk, because not every VPN vendor out there is legit and trustworthy. And so people could actually put themselves in a situation where they're creating a different kind of vulnerability because they want to use TikTok, which sure, I mean, it's fun, right? And people learn things and communicate. So it's really it's troubling. Not just that we're going to create something that's practically unenforceable, but we actually could create a law that's genuinely dangerous in a different and unexpected way. Well, it shouldn't be unexpected. If they just talk to a technologist will tell them. But I don't know that anyone in Congress is interested in having that conversation.
Well, TikTok users definitely had a field day when the CEO appeared before Congress, and some of the Congress members were talking about the technology in ways that people poked fun at. I was reading, there was recently a lawsuit from TikTok users in Montana who were suing over the ban that just last week was signed into law there. And they were basically like, why would China want my data? They don't really seem to see the data privacy concern for individual users as something that is like scary to them. And I'm just wondering, how do you think the data privacy concerns related to TikTok compare to other social media platforms to users do you think that they see logging into TikTok as more concerning than other platforms?
No, I don't think necessarily they do, but young people are actually pretty savvy when it comes to data privacy. So they do talk about it on the platform. And because TikTok is such a key platform for young demographics, like if you ask me to compare, the privacy concerns and security concerns of TikTok versus, Facebook or Google, TikTok is young people's turf still, even though it's increasingly adopted by other demographics too. But that to me is what makes it a little bit special. And so I would understand if the discussion was framed that way. Look, you know, a lot of minors are using it, young people are using it, so we need to really be careful what's going on there, and what the practices are. You know, Europe, for instance, if we want to compare, such clear and strong regulation when it comes, especially across the board, but especially when it comes to young people's data. Yeah. But the discussion is not being framed that way, right? It's being framed as this geopolitical argument. The other thing that TikTok has that is different than, let's say, Meta or Google is the strength of its algorithm, which is also very opaque. So there is that concern that the algorithm might be manipulated in ways that, you know, might be dangerous or conducive to certain political interests, because we really don't know much about how the algorithm functions, and if the algorithm is what really, you know, is the glue that holds the app together and that really explains its, to a large extent, its appeal.
Yeah, definitely. Well, okay, what if it's not a complete TikTok ban, what alternative solutions should lawmakers be considering? Corinne, do you have ideas to start us off?
You know, I do. I think it's pretty straightforward. I think what we need to do is we need comprehensive federal data privacy legislation that applies to everyone. And there have been actually proposals just in the past year or two. We finally seen some serious energy behind it, and the reason for that is because my home state of California passed a very strong privacy legislation, and that has sort of galvanized a lot of the social media companies and other companies who don't want to have to comply with 50 different states' privacy rules, which is fair. So it's encouraged them to sort of try to work with lawmakers at the federal level to just get one comprehensive rule. Now, unfortunately, you know, a lot of the tech companies would like rules that are far looser than what users actually need. So that's kind of the fight. But it is, you know, it's great to actually finally see real energy around some real comprehensive legislation, because our privacy laws are just hopelessly out of date, like decades out of date. And so that's, you know, that's what I'd like to see in the coming year. And I think I know there's lawmakers who are interested in doing it, and I think that that's a real way, that's a non-performative way to actually help the citizenry.
What about you, Brian? Alternative policy solutions, any thoughts other than completely banning TikTok?
Well, first of all, given that this is still the domain of young people, I just realized how we can solve this problem. All we have to do is a bunch of old guys like me sign up for TikTok, and then the young people will jump off just like they did Facebook when I got my account. But slightly more seriously, two things. One is I think it's worth pulling the lens back a little bit and looking at some of the other non-privacy specific threats of TikTok from the national security standpoint. And one would be, of course, not just accessing your personal data, but also accessing all your viewing preferences, all your interests. Reproductive health issues could be one of them, but all kinds of very deeply personal things that aren't actually your data, but show, you know, what you're interested in. The second one, of course, is the ability for China to inject into the mainstream of discourse in the United States misinformation, disinformation, deep fake video attacks. And we know for sure that for 100+ years, the Russia, then the Soviet Union, then Russia and China have been using all kinds of whatever technology was available at the moment to try to sow distrust and competition and racial divide and other divides inside of our country. So again, I think this is different because this is the Chinese government being able to do this stuff. And then, of course, there's also the ability to potentially, and I'm not a technologist, but potentially to put other devices on your other software on your devices that would allow them to do things like track where you go and things like that. And as a personal victim of the 2014 Office of Personnel Management hack that stole 26 million top secret security files and moved those to China, I am 100% certain China is interested in my data. Now, as to the potential solutions, one, which could be done, is for the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, which is an interagency body empowered by Congress to worry about foreign ownership of key technology and other businesses in the United States to simply order but the divestiture, the unwinding of the purchase of Musical.ly, which I defer to others how much of an impact that would have on today's TikTok. But I do believe they probably do have the authority to do that, and I think that is actually not unlikely. I think it is unlikely. I think it's likely that the government will try to do something like that. And to be straightforward about it, if China's interest, if ByteDance's interest is really in making revenue from this and empowering creators and allowing free speech and all the flowery things they talk about, they should have no problem with that, because all the revenue could still go back to China. It's just that they would be prevented from exploiting Americans through ByteDance. And then finally, and this hasn't been talked about as much as I think these other solutions, I think it's possible, even under current legal authority, and certainly Congress could give the president the authority if he doesn't have it, to impose economic sanctions on ByteDance. They could be put on a sanctions list, and they would be unable to use the U.S. banking system. So I do think there are alternatives to a ban. And of course, the best solution, I think, for everybody would be for some non-Chinese competitor to come in and take this market share away from TikTok. But I don't think that seems likely, because they've just taken the market share from all of our companies.
Yeah. Thanks. I really appreciate all that. That was like layers that I haven't gotten a chance to really dig into yet. So thank you. I wanted to, in these last few minutes, get a quick question in for Corinne. In recent years, there has been a lot of debate around the role of tech companies in regulating free speech and content moderation. How does the EFF approach this issue, and what do you think are some of the key challenges in finding a balance between protecting free speech and managing harmful content online?
Sure. So we've spent a lot of time thinking about this and working on this at a bunch of different layers. And I think just speaking purely at the platform layer, because I think it's actually a little bit different when you're going to force app stores or ISPs to do things. That's a different thing. But purely at the sort of more social media layer that we're familiar with, I think that content moderation is lawful and appropriate. It's protected by the First Amendment. You don't have to host speech that you don't want to host if you are Facebook or Twitter or a smaller website, right? So it's you have the choice to do that, and we probably want people to be able to do that. So, if I have a knitting site, I might want to make sure that people just talk about knitting there, and it's not a place where people are going to have other kinds of conversations. Totally fine, right? And if I go to that site, that's probably what I'm looking for. So it's fine to do that. The difficulty is that it's essentially impossible to really do well and precisely at scale. And so when you're a big site hosting lots and lots of content, you are extremely likely to take down or flag content as harmful or dangerous, and to make a mistake with that and sort of identify things that are maybe documenting violence but classifying that as violent content when all it is actually documenting something that is happening and trying to get the word out about it. So that's really the very tricky balance. And I don't think any of the social media companies are particularly good at it. It is not because they have any ill intent. That is one thing I want to be clear about. And I don't even think it's because they're partisan. I think it's just a really hard job. And I think that, unfortunately, many policymakers and just sort of regular people discount how challenging it is. So we sort of, from our perspective, we just think it's important to keep pointing that out so that we don't come up with so-called solutions that, like a TikTok ban, won't work and in fact are likely to backfire. So there's a number of those proposals going around right now to sort of change the rules so that social media companies are liable for everything they host, for example, as a way of encouraging them to be better at content moderation, I think is the idea. But it's not going to work, and it's going to essentially result in many social media companies just won't host content at all because it'll be too expensive. But that's probably another ours meeting. But but it's a real quandary. It's very difficult.
Yeah, thanks for explaining all of that. I think at this point we are going to start taking some questions from people in the audience, so thanks everyone for asking some smart questions here. We have one from Leonardo. Can we really expect legislators to implement effective regulations on social media when things like net neutrality are still subject to the whims of whatever party controls the White House? Maybe Brian, does that strike anything with you? Can we really expect legislators to implement effective regulations on social media when things like net neutrality are still subject to the whims of whatever party controls the White House?
Well, I think it's not so much the partisanship or which party controls the White House as it is legislators in general, and I would say perhaps the United States Congress in particular, it's very hard for them to deal with things at a very micro level. And when you're trying to regulate technology, especially technology like this that's changing so quickly, it's hard to write a law that will be sustainable when the ink is dry. So the best I think a legislature can do, and I agree that there should be a federal privacy standard, is to set very big picture goals and requirements, and then leave it to the implementers and the regulators to figure out over time how that works in any given year. So I don't think it's so much the change of party in the White House as it's just that it's very hard thing to do to regulate technology from a Congress.
Yeah. What about you, Corinne? Does partisanship in your experience reviewing policy, analyzing policy, affect the way regulations on social media are implemented?
Well, I would say yes and no. I think that as a person who is deep in the fight for net neutrality, like I felt that one pretty significantly. But then we just pivoted and took a different approach. But I agree with Brian that the trick is that it is just very, very hard to regulate tech, and especially to do it in a way that's not going to backfire. And such as by chilling innovation, or such as by actually undermining security, which is a thing that can also happen. So it's a really hard problem. And I tend to think that it's right that the approach needs to be to look to agencies and maybe empower agencies to intervene. So I would like to see the FTC, for example, intervene a lot more. And I think, but they could use a bigger budget to be able to do that. And also I would like to say one other thing, which is I just want to, while we're talking about the FTC, I just want to pick up on something else that Brian said, which is one of the alternatives that we don't talk about enough is actually having competitive alternatives. And I'm a little more hopeful about that than some other people are. I mean, I remember MySpace, and like MySpace was going to eat Facebook's lunch. And so, I am actually kind of hopeful that new technologies emerge over time, and there's probably something in the works that we haven't even thought of yet.
Yeah. Well, that kind of is a great segue into our next question from, and I hope I'm saying this right, Jaiko. Jaiko wants to know, what do you all think about decentralized social media options? Anybody, maybe have you looked at all into these decentralized social media alternatives that are popping up?
Sure. In this case, though, I think it would be really hard to make the switch from TikTok to one of these new decentralized platforms. I mean, it's hard enough, even, let's say, for instance, from Twitter to Mastodon. That's one of the moves that was talked about a lot, but it hasn't been a smooth move. We haven't really seen that critical mass of users make the switch. And TikTok, beyond the affordances that it gives the user, it has cemented this role in our cultural imagination. And it does have that role in young people's lives. And I think it's going to be really hard for a platform to just supplant that. That takes time. And of course, users care about where their friends are, where their peers are. And right now, they're on TikTok. So it would have to be a pretty mass migration. And I don't see that happening yet to other platforms, and even less so to decentralized platforms.
Yeah. Corinne, did you have thoughts on decentralized social media options and kind of that as the future? Would that be something that you might be interested in seeing?
I think it would be great. I mean, I'm all in favor of all of the experimentation possible. And because I think that one of the things that's the centralized web, really, that's not the promise of the internet. And I don't mean to be all utopian around it. I'm just saying that the internet was supposed to engender a lot of different, 1,000 flowers, meant lots of experimentation and lots of different forms of speech. And it can still do that. And in fact, it still does do that. The internet isn't just social media. The internet is many things. And so I'm excited to see experimentation around DWeb. I think it's correct, though, that we haven't seen the mass migration of Mastodon yet. That's true. So I can't say for sure that it's gonna happen, but I do see more energy around it than I've seen in a decade, I think, easily. And the demise of Twitter, or the last gasps of Twitter, however we want to characterize it, does seem to be spurring that. So at the very least, I'm just happy to see that kind of experimentation, and we'll see.
Cool.
I would also add that TikTok is really giving us glimpses into what social media users today really like. And it's definitely this media-rich, super creative kind of environment. So, the next big platform that's going to pop up will need to be tapping into this focus on media, focus on creativity, focus on collectivity that TikTok really has. And I can say this, I've experimented with the production side of TikTok too. When, I was a film major in college, the things that you can do on TikTok today, and I compare that to the nights that I spent in the studio on Final Cut Pro, it's really so impressive what you can do so quickly, so easily, so intuitive on this app in your pocket. So I think we will, or the users today really will want more of that now that that door has been opened.
What about you, Brian? Do you have any thoughts on decentralized social media options? Would it be better?
Well, it's pretty. That's pretty far outside my wheelhouse. But just putting together a couple things that Corinne and Ilyana said, it does seem like if some competitor is going to eat into TikTok's popularity, it's going to have to be with some sort of technological breakthrough. I don't know if it's all of a sudden you can put your video on a hologram that pops up off your phone, or time travel. I don't know. I'm kidding, of course, but it's going to have to be some new technology that the competitor can offer that TikTok doesn't have, that is going to get people to start to say, oh, well, I love TikTok, but man, I'd love to have that hologram in my hand.
Yeah. Our next question comes from Chris, and he's kind of tapping into something that I think is already a major question in Montana right now, whether or not it's technically feasible to do a TikTok ban. And Chris is wondering, is it conceivable that the government would work with the app stores to delist and then pull access to the phones upon an update? Corinne, do you maybe have that kind of technical knowledge to understand if anything like that is conceivable or has happened in your experience?
Well, so I'm not a technologist either, but I think what will happen is I think that what the Montana law proposes is that the app stores have to, pull those apps, at least in Montana. And the real difficulty there is, so that means they also want geofencing around states. Mm-hmm. And that's not something that we've seen. Geofencing around countries, that's also not that hard to get around if you have a VPN, but at least that we have the infrastructure is there. Geofencing around states, I actually think we should be really worried about that. I don't even know if it's possible, but let's just say for the sake of argument that it is. I think that's really scary. So we have, on a state level, people have, a different communications environment, depending on when you cross a state border. I mean, that's bizarre to me that we would want anything like that. It's very strange.
Can I just weigh in on that real quick? Because I hadn't actually spent any time thinking about this, but there is a thing in the US Constitution called the full faith and credit clause. And what it means is that every state has to treat people from other states equally. And I think something like a state geofence, if it was put into place by a government, would have a hard problem with the Constitution.
Yeah, there's certainly a lot of obstacles to the TikTok ban, and I really appreciate everybody being here today. That's all the time that we have. Thank you so much, Corinne McSherry, Brian Cunningham, Ioana Literat. And now we're going to go back over to Ken and Lee.
Wow, that was a great panel, Ashley, and I found myself agreeing almost entirely with most of it. Let me introduce Lee Hutchinson, our senior technology editor and my co-host for Ars Frontiers. Lee, I have to say, I hate to use sports metaphors, but what I feel like is the big issue here is that the matter of privacy has not been, it has not been addressed all these years. And the sports metaphor is you're supposed to skate to where the puck is. So I feel like what we're seeing now is we're caught flat-footed dealing with privacy and data protection issues that should have happened a long time ago.
Oh yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Ken. It's, I mean, it's complicated on one hand because I'm not entirely sure that something like GDPR really would fit wholly with how Americans use the internet, with like the American culture and the way that kind of things work around here. I'd love GDPR to be a thing here, or some sort of comprehensive privacy legislation, but I mean, it's also, you have to get Congress to act. We have to have some established boundaries within which they would be willing to act, and I don't really see any of that happening, frankly, as much as we absolutely need it.
Yeah, we have a very strange kind of legislative culture in the United States where we say we're not going to pass a law until we're convinced it's perfect. And I can see why people feel that way, but it is a difficult question. And now I believe we have Ashley back with us.
Howdy, Ashley.
Congratulations, Ashley. It was a great panel.
Yeah, definitely. I learned some things and I've been staring at this, so.
The interesting thing that stuck out with me was the comment about how legislation to like ban TikTok federally really may not be the way to go about if the government wanted to ban TikTok, and that would actually be more of an economic approach. And I was talking to Ken about that as we were ramping up here. Ken, what would that look like, I guess, if it wouldn't be, it wouldn't be like TikTok is now illegal, bang, law is passed. What would be the path to federally outlawing TikTok?
I mean, I don't, it's tough to say because there's two approaches. They mentioned these in Ashley's panel. One would be to take a kind of sanctions-oriented approach and basically penalize businesses, advertisers, marketers who engage with TikTok, maybe make banking impossible. But I think the second more important way, and I'd love to hear Ashley's thought on this, is, again, skate to where the puck is going, not where the puck is. And I was ridiculed in 2007 when I said that Facebook was going to turn out to be a fad. And the fact is on planet Earth, given a sufficiently long enough timeline, everything is a fad. So being so obsessed with TikTok really ignores the real problems. What do you think, Ashley?
Yeah, I mean, I would tend to agree, and I think Congress is trying to go that way with what's also kind of not maybe the best idea either, but with the Restrict Act, where they're trying to say that we're not just going to focus on TikTok, but we do need the ability to be able to control when foreign adversaries have financial control over technologies being used in the US. We need to be able to intervene. And so that's trying to give that power there in order to, again, ban the apps. And so it's really the same thing. It's just a way to get there. And we keep seeing comprehensive data privacy laws, which would seem to be like, if you want to make sure there's not foreign spying, then you would want to just limit how much data is being collected. It would solve a bunch of other societal problems. But that type of legislation, even though it's bipartisan, isn't a priority, and it doesn't ever make it to the end of the session. It just kind of blips off the calendar, then they re-present it, and then we go through the same cycle. So it would be great to see longer viewed legislation, but so far I think the TikTok ban has sort of just like cropped back up as this urgent solution. Even Biden, who had previously, seemed to take pride in reversing the ban that had been tried to push by the Trump administration, and just now all of a sudden we're back to the same place. So it'll be interesting to see where we go from here, and if Congress actually does make the move that Montana made last week.
Well, it would be fantastic if it turned out that this wasn't all just political theater, but
I was going to say, this has got to be mostly performative, at least some aspects of it, right? I mean, it has to be.
definitely feels that way. I can't speak for all of Congress.
Thank you so much, Ashley. It was absolutely great hearing your panelists, and we look forward to your reporting on this later this week.
That's right.
Yep.
Thanks, Ashley.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Okay, folks, next up, we're going to be hearing from our senior health reporter, Dr. Beth Mole, and we're going to be discussing pandemic lessons from epidemiologists. So take it away.
Hi, everyone. I'm Beth Mole, Senior Health Reporter for Ars Technica. Today, we're going to be talking about pandemic prevention and preparedness and lessons from COVID-19. We're finally exiting the emergency phase of the global crisis, but the virus is still very much with us. And pathogens with pandemic potential will inevitably keep coming, perhaps sooner rather than later. Where are we with our readiness for the next threat? What have we learned? And what are we still missing? We have a stellar panel of epidemiologists who specialize in pandemic preparedness. They'll share some thoughts with us. Before I introduce our guests, a quick reminder to drop any questions in the comments section on YouTube or in the comments on arstechnica.com, and we'll try to get to them at the end. Now I'd like our guest, Dr. Nuzzo and Dr. Caitlin Rivers. Dr. Nuzzo is the director of the Pandemic Center and a professor of epidemiology at Brown University's School of Public Health. She is also a senior fellow for global health at the Council on Foreign Relations. An epidemiologist by training, her work focuses on global health security, public health preparedness and response, and health systems resilience. Dr. Caitlin Rivers is a senior scholar at Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security. She is an epidemiologist specializing in pandemics and deliberately occurring events. Dr. Rivers recently returned from an appointment as founding associate director at the Center for Forecasting and Analytics at the Centers for Disease Prevention. So welcome to you both, and thank you for joining us.
Good to be
Thanks
here.
so much. So Dr. Nuzzo, I will start with you on a big picture. Where we are right now in the past, this unfortunate pattern of panic and neglect when it comes to pandemic preparedness. And now we're coming out of the panic phase. We've spent the last 3 years throwing resources at COVID-19, building up systems to respond. And recently there's been talk of the need to maintain those systems and resources. But amid the pandemic, we faced another health crisis, mpox, formerly monkeypox. And even with those ramped up responses to COVID-19, we still struggled to get ahead of transmission. And we even had a lot of advantages with that. We had seen that virus before. We knew about it, and we even had a vaccine. So my question to you is sort of big picture. What did we ramp up well during COVID-19 that we need to maintain now? And what did we just miss kind of and need to keep building?
Yeah, thanks so much for inviting me to this conversation. And thanks for starting off with a really easy question, which is not easy at all. First of all, I mean, I think where we are now, 3+ years after the start of the pandemic, we are clearly coming out of the crisis period. You know, the way we live our lives feels much less like a crisis than where it was 3 years ago. And I say that because actually the term that I like to talk about when we think about, you know, how much attention we pay to these issues isn't so much panic and neglect, because panic, you know, implies that what we did was not warranted or that it was irrational some way. The reality is it was a crisis. It was a real crisis, and we needed to, you know, scramble to get ahead of it because, you know, upwards of 1 million Americans died. That's just a point that I have to make because 3 years later, we tend to forget what happened. So the phrase that I like to call this is that we tend to lurch between crisis and complacency. And I would argue that while it's clear that we are coming out of the crisis, I think the complacency actually set in quite a while ago. And some of it, you know, was understandable. It's hard to live like you're in a crisis for 3 years. But nonetheless, some of it was, you know, really unfortunate because there were still many, many more things that we needed to do. But on the positive side, I mean, I think what this crisis brought us was a bunch of new tools. First of all, we now as individuals have new tools. I mean, I don't think before, at least in my 20+ year career, really remember a time where we were talking about what individuals can do to protect themselves from illness, particularly respiratory pathogens. The idea that we could use masks, we could use ventilation, we could use tests, is something quite new, and it's hopefully kind of a powerful precedent that we can carry forward when we deal with the next respiratory pathogen and the seasonal pathogens. Just the likelihood that there's going to be more of these events that we have to worry about is quite high and actually certain. And so making sure that we avail ourselves of these tools as individuals, I think, is really, really, really important. I think the other kind of positive aspect is that we have, I think, established the expectation that we should demand and expect to have pretty near to real-time data that we can use to help us navigate our lives. And that's a very new thing for public health. I mean, public health, at least when I started my career, we tended to put data out that was months, if not years old, that had been, carefully curated and vetted. And I think that's just simply not realistic in an age where, at any given moment, you can tell where the package that you ordered from Amazon is. We should have, much more of a real-time understanding of what the viral conditions in our community is like. And I think the third thing that we put into place, and this is the thing that I'm really, really worried about, probably perhaps most of all, was that if you remember 3 years ago when we started this pandemic, we didn't have anywhere near the kind of public health infrastructure, the public health defenses that we need in terms of people working in health departments to help us make sense of the data and tell us what to do to help us live, healthier, safer lives. That was something that we had to put into place through an emergency supplementary fund. We hired lots of contractors to try to go and work in health departments. And we saw that when the funding lapsed, so too did those positions. And that's actually what started off at the beginning of the mpox crisis, putting us behind. It's hard to believe that after several years of responding to the pandemic that we would really stumble in responding to a virus like mpox, which, as you mentioned, was something that we had known about. We had actually dealt with outbreaks of it in the past. We had a vaccine, we had tests, we basically had all of the resources. What we didn't have were the people. And it's really unfortunate. It's like we, built a fire station in the midst of a fire, and then, once the flames started to recede a bit, we just basically disbanded our defenses. And, I hope that's a lesson that we can take forward to the future, is that we have to maintain these protections for the long term. They're the infrastructure that should be in our communities to help keep us perpetually safe and to help us live the lives that we want to live.
Right, great. And so I wanted to zoom in next on the sort of the real-time data you were mentioning, and kick it over to Dr. Rivers, because you just got off of your return from your appointment as founding associate director of the Center for Forecasting and Outbreak Analytics at the CDC. So you kind of got an inside look at the data that's going in there. And like Dr. Nuzzo just said, it became a national pastime to look at dashboards and charts and bar graphs and test positivity rates on a daily basis almost. But we still saw, some struggles getting that data and getting those data streams up. And 50 states, different jurisdictions have different rules. There's a lot of challenges. So from your perspective, what are the big challenges? Just to get everybody on the same page about what that looks like. And then, how are things getting better or worse now as we're kind of in this exiting the emergency phase?
Yeah, well, I really agree with Dr. Nuzzo that people now have come to expect that they will have disease data at their fingertips from which they can make decisions. Do I need to move my birthday party outside because it's more highly ventilated? Should I wear a mask while I'm on the metro? Those are the kinds of little decisions that we can all make to adjust our behaviors based on the risk. But we won't know what the risk is unless we have the data. And Beth, you're exactly right that I think during the pandemic, a lot of people came to have their favorite website. Was it New York Times? Was it Washington Post? Was it COVID Tracking Project, where they would look to see what was going on in their communities? And what I saw when I was at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention just recently is that there are two main problems with our public health data. And the first is actually administrative. A lot of people don't realize that public health in the United States is federated, which means each state, and in some cases each city, operates its own public health department that is basically completely independent. And so the way that data flows from those state or local health departments to the federal government is through data use agreements. individual legal agreements with every single jurisdiction on individual public health issues. These are not blanket agreements, they're disease specific about when and how and what data will flow. And as you can imagine, it takes weeks, if not months, to organize a single agreement. We're talking hundreds of agreements altogether, and it's a very slow process. And I think that that administrative hurdle is one of the real challenges that we have with our public health data infrastructure. Now, what happened during COVID is the Public Health Emergency Declaration actually gave the federal government temporary authority to compel data reporting. So no data use agreements. Instead, send me your data and we'll get on with it. But when the public health emergency ended just recently, earlier this month, a lot of those authorities went away. And so we're really back in the place of not having a lot of the data that we've become accustomed to for COVID and certainly for other diseases. The second major problem is actually around technology. Our public health departments use fax machines to share data. They use emailed spreadsheets. And clearly that's not the way that the world works in 2023. So the good news is that Congress has appropriated about $1 billion to upgrade our nation's public health infrastructure, which is substantial. But when you're starting from fax machines, it's going to be a long road back. And so I think moving forward and making sure that process of upgrading those capabilities advances is going to be absolutely key to bring us into the modern era.
Yeah, so just wanted to ask a little bit more about those state agreements. Is it kind of going back to Dr. Nazo's point about sort of needing the people to be there to collect that data and put it into those fax machines and spreadsheets, and hopefully more technology in the future. But are those? Is there? How do the state requirements compare state to state? Is it? Can you get sort of uniform data, and what are the kind of snags to that? Uniform across the states, I mean, sorry.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, during COVID, those special authorities tied to the Public Health Emergency Declaration allowed for standardized data collection. That's actually not how it is on a lot of issues. The states can really determine what they want to send to the federal government and even what they want to collect. So it can be mismatched sometimes, and it can be a real problem if you're trying to look across states and understand what the situation is. One example that I think is really key is race and ethnicity data during COVID. This was before all of the data snags got ironed out. There was not a lot of data about the race and ethnicity of people who were getting infected, which is why we were so late to realize the health inequities in who was getting infected. It was really a data problem in terms of our recognition. And that's the kind of thing we could improve on if we had better data infrastructure.
And are those tied to legal reasons in those states' laws about what data can be collected, or is it about more of just having the resources to compile all that data? Is that all of the above kind of the situation?
It varies. In some states, the state legislatures actually have restrictions on what can be collected and shared. And so that can be a rate limiting step or a step that shapes the output. And in some cases, it's simply not the priority of a state health department to collect certain data elements, for example. And so it may be that that's just not something that they're interested in. So there's a lot of different ways the system can come unwound a little bit. And it may make sense at certain levels, like at the state level, trying to conserve your limited resources and focus on what's important. But at the national level, it's very hard to look across jurisdictions.
All right. And then, you mentioned the financial, the $1 billion that's going to go into trying to update things. Have you seen any movement? What's any of the plans for that, how that could improve? And are you optimistic?
I'm very optimistic. I think that this is so badly needed and has been needed for years and years that I think it's a really exciting opportunity to get things right. I would really like to see this opportunity take away some of the manual burden. There's a lot of manual data entry. There's a lot of faxing. There's a lot of emailing spreadsheets. And if we could claw back some of that manpower and put it towards public health practice, put it towards actually keeping people healthier, that's going to be a huge win. And so I'm very optimistic and ready to see that move forward.
Great. So next, when we have that data, when we have those signals that say a threat is upon us, we also need to know what to do. So Dr. Nazo, I was hoping you could talk about sort of the idea of pandemic preparedness drills. And you've mentioned this in some other talks, things like fire drills and earthquake drills, pandemic drills. What are some examples of the things you think might be great if we could do now, preparing for the next threat?
Yeah, so I make fire analogies a lot, and because I think there's a lot of commonalities between thinking about pandemics and fires, in part because we quite clearly understand that just because a fire goes out doesn't mean that we can't have another one. And that's actually been a challenge that we've dealt with in the pandemic space, which is once the event is over, everybody's so exhausted and tired and they never want to think about it again, that sort of gets kind of converted into a belief that we're fine. And in particular, I'm worried about that with COVID, in part because we've been talking about it like a once in a century crisis. While it has been quite a challenge compared to events of the past century, all the data that we have suggests that there could be more COVID-like events in our future and possibly even worse scenarios. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with making sure that we have the right tools to use to protect ourselves, and then also periodically remembering how to use them. And that's really where drills come into place. Now, drills are something that public health and governments use quite a bit. It helps them try to understand if all the things that they think are going to be there are actually there. I would argue that we haven't done enough of that in the recent years, particularly before the pandemic, in part because if we had, we might have realized that a lot of the resources that we thought we were starting the pandemic with, for instance, a stockpile of personal protective equipment, we might have realized that actually that stockpile had been depleted after the last pandemic in 2009. And so using drills would have been potentially helpful for us to go and look and say, turns out we don't have what we think we have. But I also think that there's a role for public drills and thinking about, knowing what to do in an event of emergency and how to protect ourselves and our families. And one of the things I was so struck by was a study that I did before the pandemic where we looked at what Taiwan was doing every flu season. So every flu season, they were holding influenza mass vaccination drills. They were doing it because they were trying to get the older folks and some of the higher risk parts of their populations to make sure that they were getting vaccinated against the flu, but they were also using that opportunity as a way to test how quickly could they vaccinate people, say if there were to be a pandemic in the future, and to make sure that everyone would know that if there were a pandemic, this is where you would go to get vaccinated. And they really used it to just kind of test the system, make sure they had the capacities, work on the throughput, and work on the, if people have to be watched for 15 minutes, where are you going to put them? Really work through the logistics of it. They've been doing it for years. And I was thought about that quite a bit when we started trying to roll out COVID vaccines here. And if you remember back to the early 2021 or late 2020, depending on what category you fell in, it was really hard to know where to get vaccinated and how to do it. People were refreshing websites and it was really quite difficult. And, had we perhaps had more planning around how we would roll out vaccines in a future pandemic, perhaps that would be easier. That said, I have to put just a real point here, which is that although we've been talking a lot about using data and using tools to protect ourselves, as individuals and making sure we know where to go, we really have to remember that that is not the same for all of us. Not all of us have equal abilities to protect ourselves and use the resources that are available. So tests are still really expensive. High quality masks are really expensive. Not everybody has the ability to refresh a vaccine website over and over again to be among the first to get vaccinated. And so it's really important while we think about using drills to make sure our plans are actually going to work and that we have the resources that we think we do, we also have to think about how to protect all of our communities. And that's actually something that we really saw play out in terms of the rollout of vaccines, where those, go to the stadium and get the vaccine, and that first wave of appointments was really selective in terms of who could actually show up. And that's where we saw deep inequities in our response. So we need to make sure that as we're kind of saying, you have all the tools available to you, that those tools are actually available to all of us. And that's going to take a lot of ground game. It's going to take a lot of community-based participation. It's going to take a lot of effort. And also remember that perhaps some of the tools that we need to protect people aren't necessarily technologies. They may actually be policies. So sick leave, making sure that people don't have to choose between earning a paycheck to feed their family and staying home so that they don't expose their coworkers. There's a lot of things that we need to do to support all of us. And I think one of the biggest lessons of this pandemic is that our underlying social vulnerabilities turned out to be our biggest pandemic vulnerabilities. So that social piece can't be ignored. It's probably the most important thing, even more so than any of the technologies that we've talked about.
Yeah. So in thinking about the tools that we have, they need to be used equitably. I think in the COVID-19 pandemic, when people talk about pandemic defenses, they often think masks, lockdowns, vaccines, but there's more that we have in our toolbox, and we need to use them equitably. But Dr. Rivers, what, from your perspective, was there any of the tools that we have that didn't get a lot of airtime during the COVID-19 pandemic that should now, as looking to prepare for the next threat, should get more attention?
That's right. Well, broadly, there are two categories of interventions that we could bring to respond to an outbreak. Pharmaceutical interventions, and here it's mostly vaccines and treatments, and non-pharmaceutical interventions. And that includes things like masking, social distancing, contact tracing, and ventilation. Now, a lot of focus has been paid on just a few of those. Vaccines, certainly, and I think that has been one of the big triumphs of our pandemic response. We developed a vaccine in record time. And despite a lot of troubles and rightful concerns about vaccine uptake or people who choose to get vaccinated, 80% of adults in the United States got the 2-dose series. And I think that's pretty remarkable. It's about double what we see in a flu season. So vaccines, I think, are a strength on which we should build. Now, non-pharmaceutical interventions, the things like masks and social distancing, have become maligned. And I think the reason that they've started to draw a lot of ire is because they were broad. They were recommended to people regardless of what was going on with the virus in each community. And the reason, again, that we had to recommend masks for everyone all the time in every county, for example, is because we didn't know where the virus is. And so that, to me, points to another data gap. If we could have better surveillance systems that are better able to pinpoint who is truly at risk, we can be a lot more targeted in those interventions. The other thing, and the last thing that I want to highlight, is that there are interventions, ways to slow transmission that don't require anyone to do anything at the individual level. And that's primarily ventilation and filtration. If we can upgrade our indoor air quality through installing new and better HVAC systems or even opening windows, that is going to reduce the risk of all sorts of respiratory viruses, and it doesn't require individuals to take action. So I think that's a fairly simple measure, expensive, but fairly simple and straightforward measure that we could install that would help flu, it would help RSV, and it would help us fight the next pandemic.
Great. So I could talk to you guys for ages, but I think we're going to move to the Q&A section now. So I have a question from Joshua. He asks, how can we close the communication gap with the public?
I can maybe start. Tomes could be written about how we should and could improve our communication. But one that I've been thinking about a lot recently is that public never really got to know a warm face from whom they could get their public health communication. So when I think about news media, for example, I don't necessarily turn to news as an institution. I turn to my favorite journalists and I turn to my favorite anchors because I've come to trust them. I don't trust the medical system as a sterile institution. I trust my doctor. And I'm not sure the public ever had an opportunity to really get to know an epidemiologist or a public health official that could talk to them regularly, day over day, about what's happening and what they should be doing. And so I think in the next crisis, really appointing someone to take on that responsibility may be really important to helping to build trust.
Yeah. And Dr. Nuzzo, I know you had a lot of conversations with the pandemic and during the pandemic about trust building and bridging gaps. So what are your thoughts on communication?
Yeah, I think first of all, when we talk about communication, sometimes we focus on the content of the information, the facts, and we think about, making sure we get the facts right, making sure that we're not having messages that are kind of at odds with what somebody else is saying. And that's really important. I think that's communication 101. But if we only focus on the content of the message, I think we're going to miss something. And the truth is, one of the things I've learned in talking to people throughout this pandemic is that the seeds of concern and if you want to call it distrust, were sown a long time ago. It's possible that it can be overcome by a trusted messenger delivering the right information, but the issues are a bit more deep rooted than that. And I'll tell you that one of the things I started hearing a lot from people was that healthcare wasn't regularly in their lives. They didn't really know what the public health agency was, and all it really did was to show up and to tell them not to do the things that they cared about, shut down their kids' schools. They saw the bars being open, but they saw the schools being closed, and that made absolutely no sense to them. Really, I think one of the challenges was that, what we were seeing is that at the beginning, a lot of people were willing to do a lot. I mean, if you look at the polling data in terms of trust in healthcare, trust in public health workers, it was actually really high in the beginning, and it was actually comparably high for both political parties. But it diverged over time, and it diverged in ways that you would probably expect if you look at, what the level of healthcare access was, what the level of access to resources was. So I do think that there's a larger governance issue at stake. And in my view, I think one of the things that the pandemic has really exposed is how much of a primary healthcare crisis we have in this country, and that if people can't regularly access medicine, such that they can build those trusted relationships, such that they can see that medicine has something to offer them, that people are there to help them live better, fuller, happier, healthier lives, I think we're going to have a hard time. So I think this issue of sort of building trust and improving communications is a bit more larger than just making the messages. I think it's partially about building the society and then improving how government functions and making sure that we just don't leave people behind in their day-to-day lives, making sure that we're showing up within communities. And that may seem incredibly daunting when we think of it at the national level, but the truth is, I think where we're going to see the progress is in communities. And this is something that communities do for each other. I mean, they do, community organizations do step in to try to help, their most vulnerable and others. And I think that we can make more progress within communities. It means that we all have a role to play. It's not just, sort of waiting for government to tell us what to do. It's also about trying to create the neighborhoods and take care of our neighbors in the way that we want to be treated.
Yeah. So I have another question so thank you very much. Those are both great answers. I have a question from Spasmolytic. Is there continuing momentum around the idea of routine monitoring of wastewater in metro areas? And should we expect public health to become more nimble and effective as a result? Doctors, start with that one.
A little bit of a delay there. I didn't quite catch it, but I think the question is about the role of wastewater in disease surveillance. And yes, I do think that wastewater is here to stay. The biggest concern that I would have is around the continuation of funding. Many of those initial investments were made on supplemental dollars, which means they don't come every year. And so if we want to keep our wastewater surveillance running, which I think we do, then we'll need to make an annual investment to make that possible. Now, where I see the biggest potential for wastewater is actually in monitoring the routine diseases that keep us out of work and out of school every winter that we don't have great visibility on. So things like RSV, adenovirus, metapneumovirus, these may not be viruses that you necessarily know the name of, but I can assure you they have found you and they have kept you sick. We don't have great ideas of where those are circulating, but wastewater can give us a better idea of when those are starting to rise. And with that information, again, we can take protective measures to maybe reach for the mask when otherwise we wouldn't. So that's the hope I have for wastewater.
And Dr. Nuzzo, did you want to add any?
Yeah, the only thing I'll say is that I think I agree. I think it's here to stay, and I think it's useful not just for the routine conditions, but also potentially monitoring for the things that we may not expect to see day in and day out. And I think one of the use cases that we saw recently was for polio virus. Polio is really tricky to do surveillance on because only about 1 in 200 people who are infected actually are discovered, and they usually are discovered because they have a severe illness such as a paralysis, for instance. So it's tricky to find otherwise, and wastewater is great. But what I think it needs in order to realize its full potential is making sure it's that there's a clear path to action. And in the case of polio virus, which is a vaccine preventable illness, we can do something when we see it turn up, which is that we can go out and try to boost vaccine coverage and do education. But I think for some of these other viruses, what we do is a little bit less clear. We can give people the information, but again, how you translate that to, how they protect themselves is a little bit less clear. So I want to make sure that what we have are good playbooks for thinking about how to respond to signals that we see in the wastewater and that we know we can do something about it. There's some analogies here to another type of environmental, sort of surveillance system, which was, 20 something years ago after September 11th, there was a big push to put in, particularly in large cities, air monitors that would sample the air continuously for the presence of certain pathogens. These were ones that were considered to be, potential bioweapons. And the thought would be that we could pick it up faster by detecting it on these, in these air monitors. The reality is we actually found a lot of hits over the years, and it turned out that they weren't necessarily public health significance, but we didn't have clear playbooks for how we dealt with the signals that the systems generated, and it ultimately sort of sunk sort of political attention and sort of practical investment in, or practical attention on those systems. So its full potential, or how it was imagined to be used, actually wasn't realized. And so anyway, I think there's a lot of potential with wastewater. I'm really excited about it, but again, like most things, the technology alone doesn't ensure the success. We need to have successful systems and a resourced health agencies to be able to act upon the results.
Okay, great. Well, I think we're coming up on our time here. So I just wanted to thank you both again for taking the time to talk with us. It's been a really interesting discussion. And I think I'm going to kick it back to Ken and Lee. So thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Beth Mole. I found that to be much more inspiring and hopeful than maybe I was expecting it.
Same, yeah.
I don't know about you, the world I live in, it's full of people who really don't trust.
We're gonna get Beth back here in just a second.
Great.
There we go.
Oh, hello,
Hey, Beth.
Dr. Beth Mole. Thank you so much for your wonderful panel.
Thank you for helping us host it. It was fun.
Absolutely. Sorry, Ken, I cut you off.
No, Beth, I'd love your input on one of the panelists suggested that what we need is a friendly face. And what I found sort of jarring about that is, for me, that was Anthony Fauci. He was the friendly face. And I just wonder,
for decades,
for a long time, but do we live in a world where there will ever be another C. Everett Koop?
Say that last part again, sorry?
Where there will ever be a C. Everett Koop?
Yes. The Surgeon General of my childhood.
Surgeon General, he took on the tobacco industry. Everybody loved him. I feel like he was the last one that people liked.
Yeah, I mean, it's sad. I thought, Dr. Fauci was a hero in a lot of ways before the pandemic. I thought, kind of nationally, on a national scale, and he really had to deal with a lot of pushback. So, I mean, I think, will there ever be one national friendly face? Maybe that'll be harder. I think, talking with, drawing on Dr. Nuss's point about sort of on a community level, building trust and responding, there can be community faces that people turn to, more regional or local friendly faces perhaps might be more effective. But, hopefully, we'll have people step into a national role and play that role again. I think there's layer of trust. So, if we have people at the national level that are saying, and they're in tune with the people at the regional level that people have more personal connections with, that could be sort of a route to build up to another Anthony Fauci 20 years ago or 10 years ago, when everyone was so happy, he had built a wonderful career on his HIV work, and he was kind of a legend. So, yeah.
Dr. Nuzzo's comments about whether people were ultimately for or against a lot of the pandemic issues, or the pandemic fixes rather, and how it broke down along access to healthcare lines was really fascinating. It's tempting to chalk all of that up to politics, like, you know, some people are just like that and some people are not. But I thought that was particularly fascinating. It was something I hadn't really considered, how closely it matches up, the access to healthcare versus the willingness to go along with pandemic restrictions. What do we do about that? Because this is going to happen again, right? I mean, it's maybe not tomorrow, maybe not in 10 years, but this is going to happen again.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of these are really daunting, you know, huge national problems of you know, our fractured healthcare system that you know, it doesn't serve everyone equally at all. We see that a lot in the data in different ways, and you know, people don't have primary care physicians. You know, the idea that a lot of the health recommendations we get are, oh, if you have questions, talk to your doctor. Most people don't have a primary care provider that they go to see regularly, and that's a really tough cookie to crack. There's a tough challenge. So, you know, improving access to care, there's healthcare deserts. You know, those are, and yet we spend a lot of money on healthcare in this country. So it's, you know, I don't know if there's a simple fix. There's, you know, more federal dollars for helping people just get basic care. Telehealth can be helpful if people have access to internet connections. But yeah, it's a really big systemic problem. I don't know if there's a 2-minute way to get to the answer there, but yeah, I think she's actually, you know, definitely right that, you know, a lot of the discrepancies are not just COVID-19 related. They are, people just don't have good connections with healthcare, and they don't let that into their lives when, you know, there's a big national event or not. So.
Oh, that's great. In just the minute we have left, I'd love to know what your thoughts are on how can we better communicate risk?
Yeah, I mean, that's I think it's a tough one, because you don't want to scare people. You want to empower them and inform them. And so it's a fine line between, you know, making something sound not too scary that they are, you know, they panic and buy all the toilet paper in the store. But also, you know, don't shrug it off and be like, it'll be okay, someone else will fix it before. So I think it's you know, it's something that has to be, you know, crafted messages about, you know, empowering people to make the best choices for their health, and make sure they understand what the risks are. And I think that was you know, a stumble at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, because we didn't know a lot about that virus. It was a novel virus. We didn't know how it spread, and there was a lot of sort of semantic conversations about how to communicate sort of airborne and risks of SARS-CoV-2. You know, it's not like measles, where you can, you know, go into a room that somebody else had been in 20 minutes ago and still have a risk of infection necessarily. But, you know, it's also not something that, you know, someone has to just directly cough into your face. You know, you can still get it from just talking with someone. So that's, and that just kind of really didn't fit well with sort of the messaging about risk that we've used before when we talk about sort of respiratory viruses. So I think it's just going to be, you know, balancing that sort of, you know, not scaring people, but making them feel empowered and informed, and take it, you know, this is a thing you need to work, you know, be concerned about, be conscious of, and then just informing people, just give them information that is practical, and you know, just very easy to grab. You know, I think things like the World Health Organization's, like, you know, I think we saw in Japan, like, you know, little cartoons about like the different risk scenarios, and like sort of easy to digest sort of health messages like that are very, very useful.
Well, thank you for sharing your insights with us and hosting the panel today. It was great to have you, Beth. All right. So up next, we have our own senior space editor, Eric Berger, who's going to be talking about satellites.
Well, hello, everyone. My name is Eric Berger, and I'm the Senior Space Editor at Ars Technica, and we're now going to move from airborne viruses to airborne satellites. Because in this panel, we're going to talk about the rise of satellites, which are providing a great benefit to people here on Earth, like internet everywhere, and the ability to fact check in the fog of war. We've certainly seen that very powerful tool from both optical and synthetic aperture satellites in the war in Ukraine. But these satellites are also finding themselves in increasingly cluttered orbits. And that's potentially a problem. But I'm thrilled to say we've got some experts here who will talk about these problems, but also some solutions. First up is Dr. Bhavya Lal, the Associate Administrator for NASA's Office of Technology, Policy, and Strategy. She has previously served as Chief Technologist at NASA. And it's really one of the key leaders of the agency as it's reaching for the moon and embracing this new era of commercial space. Next up is Charity. Hi, Bob. Yeah. Next up is Charity Whedon. She's the Vice President of Global Space Policy and Government Relations at Astroscale US. Astroscale, for those that don't know, is a company that's developing an orbital debris removal technology and testing it in space. And Charity is an expert on understanding and solving the debris issue. And finally, we have Alex Fielding, the CEO and Chairman of Privateer Space, which is focused on space safety and sustainability. Privateer is really working to develop open source solutions to visualize and track orbital debris. Alex has played senior engineering roles at places like Apple and Cisco and advises several space companies. So thank you all so much for being here. And we're going to jump right into some questions. But first of all, I want to remind everyone who's following along on YouTube to please drop some questions into the chat. We'll have a period of 7 to 10 minutes at the end of our conversation to take your questions, so you don't have to listen to mine. Let's start with you, Charity, and just talk about the growth and the number of satellites and tell us how many there are and how big of a change is this from really what's come in the six decades previously of spaceflight.
Thanks, Eric, and thanks for having me here. And when you put the word frontier together with space, that's symbiotic, isn't it? It always has to be part of the conversation. So I think of this in the last 5 to 10 years, right? What has changed? Well, everything has changed in orbit. The type of users of space data, the expertise of who's putting things in orbit has diversified. The number of countries in orbit, probably upwards of 100 today. So that has really helped the entire global community embrace and utilize space for the benefit of all society. That's a good thing. Space is thread into our everyday life, in our education products, and transportation, communication, as you mentioned, safety, security, economy. We are stuck together with space now. It's part of our society. So as you said, it is a little complicated now because over the last 6 decades, we've been using space as our own personal operating dumping ground. You launch things will break up, pieces will remain in orbit, upper stage rocket bodies will remain in orbit, and they can slowly drift down into the atmosphere as well and burn up on reentry. That's all well and good, but it's the pace of things in the last 5 to 10 years that has really shown us that the rules that we set up about 3 decades ago don't apply, are not fit for purpose today. Right? So by the numbers, I'm old enough to remember talking about the 2,500 operational satellites in orbit. And you would think, oh, wow, she's really old. But no, that was just 3 to 4 years ago. So today there's in around 7,000 operational satellites in orbit. Why do I say in around? Because it fluxes every day. Launches every day, the number of satellites for each of those launches, and then those satellites that are burning up in the atmosphere. So in around 7,000, and one operator operates 4,000 of those, right? And so this is what's to come. Starlink is the first super large constellation in orbit, and there are more to come. So this puts the question of, do we have the right rules
Are you turning left? Am I turning left? Are you planning to deorbit faster than 25 years, than 5 years, than 1 year? How are you going to do that? How are you going to communicate all this? You know, we're in this mix right now, this churn, to come up with a new way of operating in orbit, a new way of using space for benefit for everyone, but also leveraging new technologies that we leverage here on Earth to solve our hardest infrastructure problems, right? We have maintenance crews that can come pick up your car and tinker with it or add fuel to it or give you a lift somewhere. We want to bring that infrastructure and logistics into space so that we can keep space sustainable, profitable, and usable for future generations. So an interesting statistic, I got this from the European Space Agency website. There have been around 15,000 satellites total in the history of all humankind that have been launched into space. Around 10,000 are still up there, right? So the flux here, like it's like a bathtub. You're filling it with water, but the drain is not taking the water out as fast as you're filling it up. So that's what the problem we have today, but we do have solutions. We have policy solutions, we have economic solutions, financial incentives, and we have technical solutions to support this budding space industry.
Thank you very much. And so, Bobby, I'm going to turn to you and ask you how concerned we ought to be about this problem. NASA obviously has a very vested interest in low Earth orbit with the International Space Station. It periodically conducts maneuvers to get out of the way of debris and spend satellite stages and things like that, or spend rocket stages. Tell us how concerned we ought to be about this problem with the satellites and debris up there now, and with what's coming in terms of mega constellations.
So there are 4 reasons to be concerned, Eric, and I think Charity has touched on some of them. So this sheer number, this sheer volume is stressing our space traffic management system. Our systems aren't designed to ingest such vast amounts of information, and so it is starting to hit the limits of how safely we can operate. And of course, again, as Charity said, even small, these are large numbers of satellites, and even a very small fraction of them fails, it will lead to substantial creation of debris. And as in, again, the bathtub is in training. We don't have currently good ways to deorbit satellites. The third one is, these are polluting activities. Each time we launch a rocket, we are emitting large amounts of fossil fuels, and each time a satellite deorbits, there's also some atmospheric effects, and these have not been studied deeply. It's an open area of research. And then a fourth one is there's potential for negative effects to users of what are called dark skies, professional astronomers, amateur astronomers, photographers, tribes. So there's those who see this as a challenge, because basically these satellites are very bright and they affect our ability to look deeply into space. And then last but not least, it does affect, at least there's implications for how we think about space exploration. I think from human exploration, or even a space station at a judiciously chosen altitude, will perhaps not be substantially affected by the growth in the satellite population, but it's a bit of an unknown. And then again, Charity mentioned in space refueling, aggregation of exploration elements in low Earth orbit, and then added debris may be an issue. So for example, we don't know where, at least I don't know where Starship will aggregate its propellant for sending, the human landing system to the moon, right? Something that NASA cares deeply about. I think it's a bit speculative, and we need to study the effects of current mitigations for a longer period of time. But we need to start thinking about some of these deconflictions. It should not be crippling to exploration, but again, things to talk about as a community.
Thank you very much. And Alex, I wanted to ask you about how we track all of this, because it strikes me, we're using Starlink satellites to communicate in Ukraine. Russia has its own satellites, China has its own satellites, the United States has its own satellites, and many countries around the world do as well. How well are we tracking everyone's satellites and making sure that they don't run into one another?
Well, not very well. So unfortunately, I think my 4-year-old daughter knows more about sharing than we do about sharing data in space. And there are things that we do here on Earth that we haven't yet agreed to standards on space for. So things like requiring transponders or requiring the equivalent of TCAS from aviation, so traffic collision avoidance systems that talk directly between space objects as a uniform standard. We have dozens of data sources that we call on to track space objects. We use things like phase array, we use things like LiDAR, we use things like optical sensing and telescopes, we use things now space-to-space based sensing. And the problem tends to not necessarily lie in when we observe an object in space, but we certainly get it wrong when we predict it or when we try to, even measure some objects. So as an example, we, and I'm gonna use the global space we and just assume that we're all in the same support group together. We track something like 34,000-ish objects that are bigger than 10 centimeters, so bigger than a softball, that we can see that we have NORAD or other IDs on or catalog identifiers on. And let's put that in contrast. What is a catastrophic end to a Whipple shield? On like ISS, it's about 3 millimeters. So we have a big order of magnitude in what we can routinely observe and sense and detect and hopefully predict, and what is a mission ending or, we pray not life ending catastrophe in space. And I'm actually an optimist. I mean, I married a therapist, so I've got that going for me post my time at NASA. This is a very serious problem. And we as nation states must share our tracking data, and we must create standards that are the best for humanity so that we can safely operate in space around the known debris and also start to get a better grasp on the known unknowns, which are the debris smaller than that 10 centimeters on a regular basis, and ultimately have persistent tracking and have rules and standards around what's required to put an object in space and how we responsibly manage those objects once they are on orbit.
Thank you. So Charity, you mentioned there are currently about 7,000 satellites in orbit, plus or minus, what have you. But big change is obviously coming, right? When SpaceX stops blowing up starships, they're going to be putting up tens of thousands of large satellites. And Project Kuiper is going to launch, on the order of 7,000 satellites, and or less than that, but 3,000 or 4,000. Europe is talking about a mega constellation. China is getting very serious, observing what's happening in Ukraine with Starlink, about launching, 10,000 plus satellite constellation, mega constellation. You've got OneWeb, Telesat, others. How should we view this? Is this Armageddon for the low Earth orbit in terms of satellites, or can these orbits within 1,000 kilometers, so the Earth, sustain tens and tens of thousands of satellites all flying around with what's up there already?
I think that depends on the operators and those that regulate them and those that invest in them, right? So you can ask these questions of operators. You can put those pressures on them to advance and make sure they protect the investments they're launching into orbit. And I think we have a real opportunity here to come up with what we call rules of the road, right? And do you need to require maneuverability in orbit? A lot of these satellites that are going up right now have maneuverability. That's a good thing, right? They have competent astrodynamicists on board and engineers that are, keeping the constellation healthy. They're communicating to their orbital neighbors. What is not quite being done yet is making sure any defunct satellites, those that aren't working anymore, get out of Dodge really quick because they pose a hazard. And so while we can track 30,000 plus objects in space and say, warning, move left, right, out of the way of this thing, what I'm worried about are what's called lethal non-trackable objects. Those 1 to 10 centimeters that will most certainly do some damage or split a satellite into multiple pieces. We can't really reliably track those yet, right? And so commercial operators are starting to come up with solutions to track smaller and smaller pieces of debris, but there are 1 million or so of these objects. And so while 30,000 over, the vastness of space, that's not a really big deal, especially when the operators are responsible and they have maneuverability and all that. It's the collision risk of dead object against dead object that I'm concerned about. And the best thing you can do to avoid lethal non-trackable debris, LNTs, is to not create them in the first place, right? To have some rules, to have the technology and the design of your system. So if it breaks down, you can, call a tow truck or have some other sort of technology to help get it out of the way. So we're in these discussions today. They're very high level, right? So the United Nations has a long-term sustainability working group, which is wonderful. There are 21 long-term sustainability guidelines right now. High level, they need to be implemented nationally. What does that mean? What does it mean for rules and regulation? And what does industry want to do preemptively and proactively to make sure they're being good stewards of the space environment? So those discussions are going on, as are the discussions on how do we clean up, the remediation side of this, which is really exciting, especially because of the applications in the future. We can leverage this to go to the moon, Mars, and beyond, right? You're going to have to bring all you need with you. And if something breaks, you need to fix it. So we can apply that to an urgent problem today in low Earth orbit.
So just, Eric, just if I could just underscore what Charity said, as some of these issues get worked out, the ones Charity mentioned, we have better space situation awareness capabilities, better ways to track and characterize, new norms for information sharing. That is a pretty key part of increasing traffic. Future capabilities for debris, both mitigation and remediation, as Charity mentions. I think as a result of all this, the future operational environment may become far more efficient than it was previously. So we may actually come out of it winners if we do all the right things.
Yeah, Bobby, you have come from a technology background. I'm curious, how difficult is it to clean up these orbits that we're talking about? I mean, space debris is very small, and it costs a lot of delta V to move spacecraft around in low Earth orbit. I'm just wondering, is there a technology solution to this problem, or does it really have to start here on Earth with solid policy?
Well, I mean, it's not one or the other. We need solid policy, even as we are developing technology solutions. And again, Charity comes from a company that is developing a technology solution for deorbiting, right? And basically moving objects across space and out of space. There's other approaches. I think one challenge we have is there's challenges across the board. Charity mentioned lethal non-trackable debris. We need to get better at the technology for finding where these objects are. We need to get better with grasping these spinning objects. We don't really know how to do that very well. NASA is actually funding, our Space Technology Mission Directorate is funding a lot of early stage research on how to develop some of these capabilities that we can go capture spinning objects, for example. I think there is a need to do more of that. There's lots of emerging technologies that we need to be looking at. And then we also need to look at the costs, the costs and the benefits, and how the time frame over which these benefits would be captured. So all of those things need to be better understood and studied. And that's something that my office, the Office of Technology Policy and Strategy, is engaged in. And we are working together both with folks within NASA and also with the community, with companies like Privateer and Astroscale that are my colleagues on the panel today. So I think we are on a really good trajectory to find a solution to the problem.
Alex, I would ask you, we now have two sort of large commercially operated constellations up there delivering internet, OneWeb and Starlink, and obviously Amazon and others are coming along. I'm just wondering, in terms of publicly available data or data that they're sharing for tracking purposes, are they doing enough? Or if not, what could those companies and new entrants into the field really be doing to help sort of tracking and these satellites?
I think they do provide quite a lot, and they are being very responsible about how they operate and mindful, because quite honestly, it's in their best interest, right? If you're going to scale a mega constellation, you can't become your own worst enemy. There's still more to be done, and the data that is provided in those organizations and to a public audience versus to a nation state that those operators act within probably need to be a little bit more open. So as an example, we don't have in the public catalogs for how we track space objects certain things that we certainly need that are making discrepancies in our space tracking larger. So as an example, we don't know the size, shape, material properties, things like fuel on board, which lead into drag and radiation profile, which feed our astrodynamics models that ultimately lead to larger discrepancies in the catalog because of, simply known unknowns. The data is there. The data is not always publicly accessible. And I'm going to use the word publicly because there are certain catalogs where that does exist. Is it in the public catalog? Is it accessible to, maybe university students putting a CubeSat on orbit that has propulsion that may need to get out of the way of things or be responsible and mindful in that way? No, it's not by and large. So we all have to do a better job to close for those known unknowns so that we can build a better and safer space environment. And we also have to set standards. As an example, in air traffic control, we all speak one language on the radio for air traffic control, but we have systems that allow things that are in the air to talk to each other directly and fairly autonomously to avoid collisions. We need to do something similar in space and to set those standards in a uniform way so that nation states can all agree that we will cohere to those best policies and those standards and practices urgently. It seems almost fundamental that objects that go into space, as Charity said, they should have maneuverability and they should also identify themselves. And, as a transponder, transponders are very low cost, low power. Some of them are nearly no cost and no power. We need to start doing these things urgently so that we can close these gaps and begin sharing data between the mega constellations and small space operators alike so that we can avoid collisions in space. And also, to Charity and to Bobby's point, we need to make all of this data accessible so that between these sources, we can actually coordinate maneuvers autonomously, because there won't be any room to do this the way that we have been doing it in the past. I don't think sending somebody a text message is exactly a great form of technology when you need to maneuver a mega constellation. And I also think it's going to change the industry, because companies that consider themselves space situational awareness companies or traffic management companies, I don't think there should be a market to charge people to not crash in space. I do think there should be a market to go clean up space. I do think there should be a market for us to operate responsibly in space, but I don't think we should extort people to not crash in space. That seems somewhat obvious and fairly ludicrous. You wouldn't get on a commercial plane if somebody told you, give me $10 and we won't crash. But we have to solve for that in space as well.
We got a lot of audience questions. I just want to ask one more quick one of each of you before we go into that. And so my daughter is a big Titanic fan. And so I'm just wondering, if sort of the Kessler syndrome and is the iceberg, and we're all in the Titanic sailing toward this undesirable outcome, where are we sort of in that journey in terms of risk of just sort of reaching a point of unsustainability in low Earth orbit? Are we just leaving Southampton on board the ship? Is the ship not built yet? Or are we like a mile or two away and the captain is putting on the steam?
I'll try this one. That's a great analogy. And it's so tough, right? So the previous panel, they said something that really hit home. It's like, we tend to lurch between crisis and complacency. And then just hit really right here, because it's kind of true across multiple topics, including the space environment. You also asked, is this Armageddon? No, it's not Armageddon. We have the tools and the technology, we can rebuild it, this sort of thing. But there are humans in orbit today doing incredible things, right? Do we want to toy with that? Like, our society and economy relies on space. We can't afford to get this wrong. So I would say it's more like those Berge bits that we're hitting on the side, giving us some warning signs that we need to do something. Maybe we need to maneuver before we get any closer to the large one.
Bobby?
I would say, it's a tough question. And at NASA especially, we try not to predict the future, we try to make it. So I think if we follow, some of the rules and guidelines that we've talked about, I think we are likely in good shape. I'm not one of those people who likes to kind of do the sky is falling. I think this is a manageable problem. We just need to take it seriously. And again, just, I know you can't predict the future from the past, but in the last 20 years, there's been one instance of an active satellite hitting a piece of trackable debris, and standards and guidelines wouldn't have done anything to prevent that. So I think we need to, and again, the future is not like the past. We have that many more satellites. However, I think we just need to kind of not overreact. We need to be data driven. We need to look at, how we can make things better. And I think that's the way to go, rather than trying to do things that just, prevent one, community from, let's just say, commercial, space internet companies to not be able to succeed. I think this is, space isn't owned by any one particular stakeholders, astronomers and, space internet companies and companies that clean up. I mean, it's a space ecosystem, and we need to figure out how to work together with each other to make things better. And I'm confident that we're on the right track.
And very quickly, Alex.
So I'll quickly hit 3 points on the Titanic analogy. One, definitely take the warnings seriously, right? So first of all, if you take the warnings seriously, that's pretty important. And I mean that NASA, kindly provides the NASA Cara tools. We at Privateer, you can stream your data in to stream out a byproduct of the Cara tools, which are conjunction data messages that tell operators when they are in high risk, both 2D and 3D probability of risk of certain conjunctions. You can get those for free. Use them, make sure that you identify the risk intelligently. 2, definitely try to avoid, based on that risk, driving into ice. That's important. Try to actually actively coordinate maneuvers and cooperate. And 3, share the door. I'm not going to go into all the deep reasons why there may have been enough room on the door for both parties, but the door, in this case, is the data. We need to share the data, and we need to coordinate maneuvers so that while we all think we're doing the right thing to avoid risk, so that we don't end up in even greater risk. And if there is room on the door for 2 people, I mean, share the door. That seems important. So those 3.
Great. Charity, thank you. If I ever start a newsletter on computing, I'm going to call it the Birdie Bits. So we're gonna do an audience Q&A here for a few minutes. The first question is, what about the military involvement? Does that completely hinder our ability to share information on satellite locations? Because obviously different countries have assets that they don't really want to disclose all of that information.
I'd love to take a quick stab at that one, because I think our motivation here is to improve life on Earth via space, right? We're using space technology to solve a lot of global macro problems. And if we're going to build a truly enduring space economy, we have to work together, not just as a nation, but as a planet. And today there are laws and regulations and requirements in each nation state for how we share space-based data and how we consume it and how we even process it. And this is going to slow us down and hinder us to building a global enduring space economy. As an example, there are certain laws and regulations in certain countries on how we as consumers of space data, so I'm going to flip the equation from operators to consumers, can actually get our hands on these data to solve giant problems like climate change or ESG applications or supply chain problems or G2K problems. If you look at the largest users of space-based data today, it remains largely government by dollars, but we want to see that move to Global 2000, to commercial and to consumer. And the only way to move that stack into the hands of entrepreneurs everywhere is to unify and set standards that are fair across nations so that we can share the capability, so that we don't have to duplicate the capability in space. I mean, if you have one camera looking at a certain place and you can take one picture and share the picture, I would rather do that than fly 50 cameras taking the same photograph, as a bad broken analogy. So that, I would say those standards need to become unified globally so that we can better access space and share the resources we have.
And we have a lot of models, right? I mean, we have so many countries that are collaborating on the International Space Station. We know how to collaborate even with adversaries. So I think this is not a new problem. We have lessons we can learn from other domains, aviation, for example. Both the government and the private sector has been working with their counterparts in other countries for many years exactly on this issue. I mean, obviously it's going to be more complex in the future, but we have a good start.
Well, space is very big, and it seems like it's unlimited. Unfortunately, our time here is not. I'm being told to wrap it up. I just did want to thank Charity and Bhavya and Alex for your time and for such an insightful conversation. Thanks for joining us today at Ars Frontiers.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, Eric. Bye, Charity. Bye, Alex.
Bye. Thank you so much.
Great. That was fantastic. Yes, indeed. Thank you. It's kind of scary.
Yeah, it's a little scary. I did a piece about 10 years ago about how NASA avoids debris from the International Space Station, and the situation has gotten a lot more complicated since then. And it was complicated back then too. It was they had a really nice system with U.S. Stratcom on the ground and radars and everything, but that was before the commercial launch industry really was operational. And now the situation is vastly more complicated because, as the panel noted, we have thousands more objects in orbit now than we did even 10 years ago, which is insane. It's very crowded up there. And it sounds like there's a lot of space, like Eric said in his closing, but I mean, honestly, there's really not. There are only certain areas where you can have your satellites that need to be in the geostationary. The Clark belt is only at a certain height. The International Space Station and most low Earth orbits are at a very specific height. So it feels like there's a massive amount of space, but to be usable, a lot of these satellites have to be in very specific orbits, very specific altitudes, and they get crowded. Yeah.
All right, I think we have Eric Berger here with us.
Hey, there he is.
There's the guy. Great panel, Eric. I got a simple question for you. Why don't we just shoot lasers at the debris and blow it out into space? Like literally push the debris.
I'm just sort of stupefied by the question there. The problem is if you shoot lasers out into space, you're going to make more debris. And some of that may go higher and out of the orbit, and others will not, others will come down. And also, like, if your laser misses and it hits a Chinese satellite, they're probably going to be upset about that as well. And so it just, generally in the past, when we've shot things up at satellites, it's been very bad.
You don't think there's any way that we can use some kind of force to just push them out of orbit into space? They have to be captured. It seemed like that was the consensus, is we've got to figure a way to capture and track.
The problem with that, one of the problems with that is that it requires an extraordinary amount of energy to raise the orbit of a satellite or any piece of debris. And so you're just kind of fighting against that. And until you go like thousands of kilometers above the Earth, it's always going to come back eventually.
You spend a lot of time, Eric, talking with commercial launch providers. How are, just without getting like too deep into it, because we only have a couple of minutes, how generally is the industry responding to this threat?
It's interestingly, the industry is quite concerned about it because you're seeing launch windows close or have, like, if you have an hour launch window, there may be like several 6-minute periods that you can't launch in there because of concerns about conjunctions with existing satellites or debris or things like that. And so from that perspective, launch providers like Peter Beck and Tori Bruno have both spoken out about concerns about congestion in orbit for that very reason. Of course, they're going on to launch more satellites for their customers. But that's a concern. Launch providers are cognizant of the issue. I mean, you've seen SpaceX and Starlink be pretty responsive to concerns raised by regulators, but really this needs to be a global solution because it's not just US companies, it's Europe, it's China, it's Russia, it's everybody sort of is putting stuff up there, and everyone has a stake in making sure that it's sustainable.
Well, and there's also, I know this is kind of a fringe thing, it's not necessarily an economic issue, but the more crowded orbital space gets, the more difficult the situation gets with ground-based astronomy also. I know Starlink is doing amazing things and good for SpaceX for doing it. I think ultimately it's a positive thing, but it's really kind of making life difficult, especially for amateur astronomers who have to suddenly deal with these massive constellations of satellites where there weren't any before. I mean, is there a way to kind of meet in the middle here?
So Bhavya touched on the issue of affecting the astronomy community and also just people who love the night sky. I mean, you go outside in a dark area you will see many satellites passing overhead now. And it's really pretty, it's unavoidable. There really is no way to meet in the middle on this, unfortunately. We're going to have to decide as a civilization whether we value having a pristine night sky or whether we have, all of these services that satellites, deliver. And for purely physics reasons, you cannot put your internet satellites really at geostationary orbit way up high where they're not really visible from the ground because of lag between the ground and up there and back. So it's a very difficult issue. And so the challenge is that the Pandora's box has been opened up. The horse has left the barn. I can't think of another analogy to throw in there, but I mean, we sort of are marching headlong into this future, and it's difficult to see the United States pulling back when China's expressed an interest in these kinds of constellations, and Europe has. And so it's really unfortunate, but at the end of the day, these are objects that are pretty close to the ground, and they're bright, and there's sun is shining off them, and there's just, I have an astronomy background. It's fairly disconcerting.
All right. Well, Eric, thank you very much for being with us. Next up, we are going to hear from R's senior science editor, Dr. John Timmer, and fun tricks with mRNA. See you guys in just a second.
Hi, I'm John Timmer. I'm Ars Technica's science editor, and we're here to talk about RNAs, mRNAs in vaccines and therapies. And joining me today are Dr. Karen Bach, who's the Director of Pandemic Preparedness and Emergency Response at the National Institutes of Health. And we also have Dr. Nathaniel Wong, who's the CEO and co-founder of Replicate Bioscience, which is developing RNAs to be used as therapies. So I probably don't have to tell you about messenger RNAs. We've, in rapid succession, went from most of you not knowing what they are to most of us having them injected in us over the last few years. What I will do to set this up is say an mRNA is basically an RNA molecule that has the sequences necessary to get translated into a protein, and proteins are what do most of the things in your cell. So with that, we've known about mRNAs for about half a century. Why did it take so long to translate that knowledge into useful therapies? And where were we when this pandemic started? So what were the technical hurdles that had to be overcome for mRNA technology to prove useful to us? Why don't you start us off with that, Dr. Bach?
Thank you, John. It's a pleasure to be here. Yeah, you're right. There were a lot of years that led up to what we could do during the pandemic. I think the two main technical hurdles that we had to overcome is first, how to get that mRNA inside the cell. That was something that other technologies like mRNA, RNA interference were also working on. So eventually we landed on the lipid nanoparticles, which is a vessel to get that mRNA inside the cell, and the cell with endocytosis can get it inside. I think the second hurdle is how could we dial down mRNA? Because mRNA is present in our cells, but it's also present in other things like viruses. So cells typically, when they see external mRNA, they sound the alarm. They put up all the red flags to attack an external mRNA. So how could we dial down that U, the hallmark of the uridine, the hallmark of the mRNA, to make sure the cell didn't react against it? And then the mRNA could produce the protein, as you mentioned before.
All right. So how do they work as vaccines? What do they do once they get into the cell that allows an immune response, a specific immune response to develop? Nathaniel, do you want to take us through that?
Yeah, absolutely. So an RNA, as you had mentioned previously, is an instruction manual that tells a cell how to produce a protein. And so you end up getting this rapid burst of protein, and then it rapidly goes away. But if you use that to encode some kind of foreign protein, like a piece of a virus or a piece of a bacteria, then it helps put up a wanted poster to the immune system that says, this is a pathogen, you need to be on the lookout for, that trains the immune system to go after and find it and eliminate it when it encounters it.
All right. What advantages do mRNAs have over other vaccine technologies, some of which have been around for decades? And anyone can field that.
So for my field, and you mentioned I'm the director of pandemic preparedness at the Vaccine Research Center, not the whole NIH. For my field, one of the best advantages of mRNA is the speed of manufacturing. When you use biological materials, which is not mRNA, other vaccine platforms, you have to wait a long time to test them, to clear them, in order to make sure they're safe and they're ready to go into a human. mRNA is synthetic, so it's not only fast to manufacture, that we don't have to test as many things because we're not using cells or other biological components. So the time it takes to manufacture a vaccine, and it's half or less than any other vaccine. And that lets us not only manufacture a lot faster, but also manufacture many different prototypes of vaccines, and we can test them in animals or in clinical trials. So it's very useful to move science faster and to respond to pandemics or emergencies faster.
And I just wanted to add on to that and talk a little bit about some of those processes, just to give listeners a better sense of that. So in some cases, like the flu vaccines, you'll end up growing some of these in eggs, and you grow the influenza virus in an egg, you passage it to another egg, and so on and so forth until it gets used to growing in eggs. And then you isolate that, and that's what ultimately goes into people in terms of attenuated viruses. As Karen had mentioned, there are other types of vaccines where you're isolating proteins from cells at very large scales, whether you're isolating proteins from bacteria or from mammalian cells. And you need a different process for that manufacture for each individual pathogen. What's really nice about RNA technologies is it's fundamentally the same process. So you don't need to recreate a manufacturing process for flu versus COVID-19 versus Epstein-Barr virus. You just change the sequence that's in the RNA itself, but the way you manufacture and purify that material is the same. And that's why it's so much faster to be able to generate material that you can test in those animal models and eventually test in people as well. So it is a massive acceleration of the drug development process.
All right, so far we've been talking about vaccines, but there's a lot of work going into using them therapeutically for other diseases, including genetic diseases. How is mRNA helpful there, and how does that differ from what's being done with vaccines?
Yeah, so I can tackle that first. I think that one of the things to recognize is this is really the earliest days for the use of mRNA in terms of therapeutics. And it's also important to note that there are none that are currently approved by the FDA. And part of the reason why it's the earliest days is with mRNA, as I had mentioned previously, you get this quick burst of protein and then it rapidly goes away. And what you ultimately need for a lot of complex infectious diseases is you need more protein that's expressed for a longer period of time if you want to tackle more complex areas like oncology or autoimmune disorders or certain types of metabolic disorders. That being said, there's been some recent advances in the field, and people may have seen the headlines recently about the technology being used in personalized approaches to combat cancer, cancers such as melanoma or colorectal cancers. And in these cases, you're helping the immune system recognize some of the proteins that are associated with those cancers that are individualized to those patients. And while it's had some early success in clinical trials, I think one of the drawbacks of that is that those personalized approaches can be very expensive. And so, some of the future efforts will be building off of some of those successes, but also trying to find more off-the-shelf approaches that are better for patients and more cost-effective.
Okay. that you're saying that we're still developing the technology of mRNA. How will that influence future vaccine developments? What are some of the targets we're looking at there?
I think one of the things that we're still trying to understand how we can use mRNA most efficiently. What is the actual schedule? Is it 4 weeks or 3 weeks in between doses the best? Is it 2 bolus of doses just enough, or you can do continuous administration of a vaccine? I think what we're still trying to learn also is how we can improve the durability of a vaccine. Some of the durability issues we had with coronavirus are also because of the virus. The virus is not, infection is not durable either. But there's also a lot of research looking at how can we improve vaccines delivered through mRNA to be more effective and more durable.
And to build on that, I think that there's also a lot of new RNA technologies that are starting to come online. So, for instance, if we think of the RNA technology that made it into the COVID-19 vaccines, for simplicity, let's call that RNA 1.0. I think there's a new class of RNA technologies that are starting to be developed that combine the best of synthetic biology as well as technology from other types of biotherapeutics like virally derived platforms. So some of these things are called self-replicating RNAs. And what's interesting is when you look in animal models, you can dose at 1/1,000,000th the dose of what we've been able to do with RNA 1.0 and still get those protective immune responses. And so if we're able to advance some of those technology clinically, and some of these will be tested later this year, if you're able to maintain some of that heightened bioactivity, that could be transformational for things like pandemic responses. So the current vaccines are dosed around 100 micrograms. If you were able to get that down to 0.1 micrograms or 1,000-fold lower in terms of dose, you're talking about being able to generate 100 million doses in something the size of a 2-liter soda container. Right. And so I think that that could be great in terms of the deployability of these new technologies. And some of these new technologies are also better at stimulating the immune responses. And so they may be able to get to that single dose that Karen was talking about, and may also have better durability in terms of the length at which those immune responses last. So those are just some examples of some of the new technologies that are going to be tested clinically shortly.
So, Dr. Bach, what additional infectious diseases are we looking at potentially seeing vaccines for, and might we see mRNAs moving into areas where there are already effective vaccines?
So one of the things that, I mean, I'm sure you know, but one of the things that is important to clarify is the mRNA is just the vessel, it's the delivery vehicle. So let's say you have your sandwich for lunch. mRNA is the bread that you choose to deliver that sandwich. So vaccines in general can be delivered by many different technologies, and that's why we call mRNA a platform. So when we do research, especially early R&D, we try to design the vaccine, the antigen, and study the disease. And eventually, when you get closer to the clinical stage of testing in humans, then you decide which one is going to be the platform that you're going to deliver the vaccine. Is it going to be a protein? Is it going to be mRNA? Is it going to be a vector, etc.? I think mRNA is especially useful when you have emerging infectious diseases, just because of the speed. When you have a virus that varies a lot, in the case of coronavirus, that we need to update it maybe yearly, and we can make that decision later. Like for now, coronavirus, for the flu vaccine, you had to make the decision in March to have a vaccine by September. But now for coronavirus, because it's mRNA, you make the decision in June. So you have more data, and you make the decision better informed. There are other diseases. So mRNA has the advantage that goes inside the cell. So there are some diseases that need to have cell-based immune responses and based on the antigen being presented by that cell. So it's a little bit of a different immunity pathway that you have with mRNA vaccines. So I think you have to take all those characteristics in mind when you're designing your target product profile and deciding which platform you're going to use to deliver your vaccine.
So go ahead. Sorry to interrupt.
I was just going to build on some of what Karen was talking about, because I think that's exactly right, with the speed that it takes to develop these things in terms of emerging pathogens and seasonal pathogens. But the other thing to take into account is another point that she brought up, which is durability. So how long does that immunity last? If you're looking at immunity that lasts somewhere between 6 months to a year, again, that's great in terms of pandemics or emergent viruses where we need a very rapid response to help form a firewall. That's also good for seasonal vaccines where you may need to change seasonally anyway. So if you're only protected against this season's flu virus for 6 months, but it's going to change by next year anyway, that may be sufficient. But for a lot of the vaccines that we're familiar with, vaccines that we get in our childhood or vaccines where we get updates once every 10 years, there's an expectation that immunity lasts for longer. And so that's one of the reasons why with conventional mRNA technology, it's focused on things where you either need a rapid response or you don't need it to last for as long. But as some of these newer technologies come online and you're able to build on that durability and you're able to target more pathogens at the same time, that's when I think it will become much more competitive with other types of vaccine technologies and make more of an inroad into complex infectious diseases. So I think that technological advancement is going to be critical to deliver on that promise of RNA from what we've seen in these early days.
So moving beyond infectious diseases, you mentioned cancer as one potential target. What other sorts of non-infectious diseases might RNA therapies prove useful for?
So I liked the analogy that Karen gave about a sandwich, and this is just the sandwich by which we deliver things. And I think that there's a lot of therapeutic molecules out there that either have very short half-lives where you need to inject patients daily. A lot of people get daily subcutaneous injections for things like autoimmune disorders. And with some of these next generation RNA technologies, you can have durable expression of these proteins for up to a month or 2 months or even longer. And so that brings up the possibility that instead of having to do daily injections, you might be able to do monthly injections or every few months for those types of patients. And those would be in areas such as autoimmune disorders. There's also molecules out there. I think we've all seen these GLP-1 type of drugs that have started to emerge, whether it's in obesity or other areas. The half-life of these molecules is on the order of minutes before they end up going away. And so having technologies where you can have a constant expression of these proteins for a longer period of time is something that may be advantageous from a dosing perspective. And so these are immediate areas in which this technology can start to expand in terms of therapeutic areas in autoimmunity and metabolic disorders.
All right. As we're getting very close to moving over to the Q&A portion of things, I wanted to ask you both, what are you most excited about seeing in the next few years now that mRNA has had its sort of big coming out party?
I'm excited about a lot of things. Scientifically speaking, I think one of the struggles, especially in the US, is make sure we instill confidence. mRNA is very safe. It's very well studied, even though it's a new technology. Like you said, it has been studied for at least 2 decades, if not more. So I think our R&D excitement needs to come hand in hand with how do we instill trust in vaccines, but also in mRNA vaccines, which is a fantastic new technology that we can use for many, many infectious diseases that we don't have vaccines for. So that's what I'm excited about.
And from my end, speaking on behalf of some of the new technologies, very excited to see how they can expand the current use cases of conventional mRNA and, again, deliver on that promise to billions of more patients out there, but also wanted to echo that it's important, especially with some of these newer technologies, to have strong communication about them, strong communication about the fundamental safety that they have as a technology and how these are fundamentally nothing new. They're a different take on something and they're an improvement on them. But again, these types of technology have existed for decades and have proved to be extremely safe.
Okay, so at this point, we're going to move over to audience questions, and I'd remind the audience that you could leave them in either the Ars discussion or the YouTube comments. So first, we have one from Bob, who said that mRNA research had been ongoing for a while, but he's heard it's frustrating and so finicky that it was difficult to turn into an operational therapy. Have we hit an inflection point where those concerns are in the past, or is RNA still a nightmare to work with in some ways?
We're starting to implement our own manufacturing here, but from what I hear from our collaborators in industry, it's not. It's very well standardized by now. The technology is easy. Like Dr. Wang said, it's just changing the sequence. It's exactly the same recipe protocol for every vaccine or every therapeutic you make. So it is very well standardized. Right now, it's a matter of making improvements to that technique, but it's very well standardized. Yeah.
So I think it's hard to remember anything before the pandemic sometimes, but people were ready to take RNA technologies behind the shed and shoot it. There was real questions on whether it could ever scale, whether it was ever going to be commercially deployable, whether there were going to be fundamental safety questions. And I think what the past few years have done is really answer all of those questions with a resounding yes. It is a scalable technology. It can be manufactured. It can be safe and deployable. And so I do believe that we hit an inflection point, and you're going to see a real acceleration of the technology going forward. Because those major risks of the technology have been answered, because the questioner is exactly right. That was the main cloud hovering over the technology, even as February of 2020.
So a small follow-up from me on that. One of the things we weren't sure about was the refrigeration requirements, which can make it difficult to distribute these vaccines to developing economies. Is that something we were just being cautious about and we can probably relax somewhat, or is that an ongoing concern here?
So that is a concern for every vaccine. The only thing that helps you overcome the barrier of not having to store at -80 is research. It's finding the right formulation, finding the right buffer, the right liquid, where mRNA is going to be stable at fridge at 4 degrees. So historically in the lab, when it was at the R&D level, we have freezers that are very accessible to us. So we don't really concentrate on let's have it at 4 degrees, because that's more of a once you get the vaccine out there kind of problem. So now that we were going to get that vaccine out there, the manufacturers invested a lot of resources in optimizing those buffers, and now it's stored in the fridge, and it's not a problem. And that is usually the case for any research vaccine. Once you invest in that research, you can upgrade the storage conditions. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Absolutely. And I think that a lot of this comes down to time, temperature, and pH for these things. They don't like high temperatures. You don't want to leave them at high temperatures for longer, and the wrong pH can cause it to fall apart. And so where I think that there's been a lot of progress in the last year or so, and we're going to see that really speed up, is in a process called lyophilization, where you're removing water from the vaccines themselves, and water is what causes the molecules to really fall apart. It causes the backbone to just start falling apart. And so by removing the process, the water in a process that is essentially freeze drying it, you end up increasing the stability. And I think that there's a lot of players out there who are already getting it closer to normal 4-degree refrigeration. And I think that there's starting to be line of sight to have more room temperature storage. But I think it's really important for the field to focus on these things, because it's critical for access, especially in LMICs.
All right. So we have something from Dustin, who is asking about whether there has been progress. He's heard talk of HIV vaccines based on mRNA. Are you hearing anything about that, and what's the status these days?
So our center, the Vaccine Research Center, was founded by President Clinton to work on HIV vaccines. We're still looking for an HIV vaccine. That's the bad news. But the good news is all that we learned from HIV saved us during the pandemic. So the technology we use for the coronavirus vaccine comes from HIV research. mRNA, like I said, is the bread that you deliver the sandwich with. So we need to work on the antigen on the HIV vaccine itself and also test it with mRNA just to see if it has any advantages. But I think the real hurdle here is that the virus is very, very difficult. It's the most difficult virus we've ever studied. And not only we have to stop or prevent a person from being infected, also, if people get infected, how do we clear those silent reservoirs, right? So it is a very, very challenging disease. And I don't think mRNA will help, but I don't think it'll be the make it or break it technology for HIV.
Right. Another question from Bob, who asks, are there any broad categories of diseases or conditions that are more amenable to mRNA therapies than others?
I think we mentioned the emergent infectious diseases, not only the ones we know about, the ones that we don't know about. Coronavirus, SARS-CoV-2 was a new virus we didn't know about. So if in the future, so that's where our NIAID pandemic preparedness plan is based on. We are busy right now studying prototype pathogens, examples of every virus family. So if in the future we get a new virus that we don't know about, we'll be ready between the knowledge we accumulated in mRNA to respond as fast as we can. And that's the main advantage of mRNA technology.
And building on that, in the infectious disease side, the next nearest targets are going to be more complex infectious diseases, whether it's Epstein-Barr virus, whether it's seasonal influenza, things of that nature. The next nearest to that is probably going to be these approaches in oncology, melanoma and colorectal cancer, and so-called cancer vaccines, where you're turning on the immune system to recognize them. Further afield is going to be areas like autoimmunity and metabolic disorders, and those are probably going to be secreted molecules, so molecules that are spit out of the cell that will have different effects, and so on and so forth.
Okay, very short question because we're almost out of time, and it's probably the most complicated one I've got left, which is, mRNA took a bit of a bruise from the politicization of the response to the pandemic. How do we restore trust in this technology at this point?
Well, complicated and short do not go in the same sentence, John. So that's what I was talking about before, restoring confidence. It's funny because we scientists are so proud of Operation Warp Speed and how fast we made things, but that kind of built some mistrust. But the reason we were able to do it that fast is because we had 20 years of research in coronavirus, and because we had 20 years of research in mRNA. So we only took financial risks. We bet money. We didn't bet anything else. The safety was always the same.
All right.
And I would just add that if we have a few seconds left, that I think authenticity is critical when we communicate science, that we highlight the drawbacks of technologies as well as the benefits of them, to be honest and transparent with the public on that front. And I think that in terms of safety, people have been extremely transparent about it. And so what you see out there reported by the scientific community is what you've gotten. So
great.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
Dr. Bach, Dr. Wong, thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate you sharing your insights with us.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. My pleasure.
And we're back. We'll get Jay here in just a second to follow up a little bit. But this is an area that I don't really know a lot about, other than being on the receiving end of it when I got vaccinated along with everybody else, right? mRNA is not really something that you think about day to day, at least not for me. I don't know, maybe you go in different circles.
No, well, I've...
Here, wait, hold on. Before you answer, we've got Jay.
We have Jay.
Dr. Timmer, how are you doing?
quick question for you.
Yes.
When did mRNA really hit the scene?
You know, how do you define hit the scene? That's
used in a wide therapy.
Oh, the pandemic. This was it.
This was the first one.
Yeah. So there's been lots of talk about using different forms of RNA. There's a whole bunch of additional ones like short interfering and so on for decades, and a lot of biotech companies came and went trying to develop these. But throughout that churn, there were the sort of pieces were being put in place, and so everything was sort of set by the time the pandemic was here.
Do the science thing and de-hype me a little bit. Broadly, what classes of health issues are not going to be benefiting from mRNA technology like we've been talking about?
Well, mRNAs are ways of making proteins.
Right.
So anything that doesn't depend on a protein, I think, Dr. Bach was talking about it being a sandwich, and there's going to be some diseases where the best thing is to have a response to many, many proteins. And so, an mRNA is probably not going to be the most efficient way of doing that. And then there's lots of diseases in your body that are not easy to fix with a single protein, or you need the protein in very, very specific cells, and that raises a whole bunch of additional challenges in terms of getting the mRNA where it's actually needed. So there's plenty of things that won't work.
Or is it just broad? We just injection and that's it. We have no targeted mRNA delivery at this point?
Not yet. There's lots of ideas there, but they're very much in the development. Vaccines have the advantage of, as long as some cells are expressing the protein, then you're probably going to get a response.
Do you see more, again, I know this is not technically your field, you're not an epidemiologist or anything, or a virologist or whatever, but do you see more usage of mRNA therapy as a vaccine or as a therapeutic, as a fix?
I mean, it's hard to say long term. Obviously we have fewer vaccines than small molecule drugs. Then that's just the nature of there are fewer diseases we really need to prevent. So I would think long term, if the technology does prove out, that you'll see more use for non-infectious diseases, but I think most of what you'll see over the next few decades is going to be infectious diseases.
Okay.
That's great. Well, thank you so much, John. Really enjoyed your panel.
Thank you very much.
Great. So now we're going to move on to what has quickly become the talk of the town, as one might say, to the world of generative AI. This panel will be hosted by our own AI and machine learning reporter, Benj Edwards. Benj.
Oh, hi. I didn't see you there. Welcome to my office. I'm Benj Edwards, a large language model, otherwise known as Ars Technica's AI and machine learning reporter. And you're watching the lightning onset of AI. What has suddenly changed? While AI has been around since the 1950s, recent advancements in generative AI systems have enabled impressive creative feats such as writing, chatting, and creating images. We've quickly gone from a world where very few have heard of things like ChatGPT, because it only came out 6 months ago, to a time where the entire tech industry is racing to integrate them into their products. So what we're going to do today is explore what exactly has happened in the past few years to enable this apparent leap in technology. And to help us answer those questions, we've invited two very distinguished guests to our panel. But before I introduce them, I want to give a quick reminder to send any questions for them to the comments on YouTube. Okay, so on to the panelists. First, Paige Bailey is the lead product manager for generative models at Google DeepMind. She's in charge of the Palm 2 model and the new Gemini large language model under training Previously, she spent over a year at Microsoft as Director of Machine Learning and ML Ops for GitHub, working on GitHub code spaces and Copilot. Welcome, Paige.
Thank you. I'm really excited to be here and can't wait to hear the audience's questions and to learn more about what folks are excited about for generative AI.
That's awesome. And next, Haiyan Zhang, the General Manager of Gaming AI at Xbox. She has over 20 years of experience in software engineering, hardware R&D, and service design. She's also the former host of the BBC TV tech series Big Life Fix. Welcome, Haiyan.
Hey, Benj, great to be here. Great to be chatting with you and Paige as well.
Awesome. It's great to have both of you here. Now, I'll just get to the questions. Since we're going to be discussing AI, and it's kind of a nebulous term, I want to take just a minute, maybe in a sentence, could you tell me what AI means to you? Like, what's the definition of AI? Paige, do you want to do it first?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So in general, I know that there's been a lot of hype around like, what is AI? How is AI different than machine learning? Is it an evolution of machine learning? And really, I like to think of AI as helping derive patterns from data and use it to predict insights. So you can think of AI as just a way to take the wealth of knowledge, the wealth of data that's been collected over time, and to be able to do really interesting things like we've seen with models like Palm 2 and with GPT-4 to create text, to create, to generate code samples, to explain code, all those sorts of things. So really, it's not anything more than just deriving insights from data and using it to make predictions and to make even more useful information.
Haiyan, what do you think about AI?
Oh, wow. Yeah, building on Paige's description, I'd say, so, I focus on video games, and we think of video games as the ultimate expression of human creativity. It's an art form for people to experience. And we see the transformation of AI from using these algorithms, these models to analyze data, to look for patterns in data, to classify data, now evolving to having creative capabilities, both in language and image and code. And we see these creative generative capabilities having ultimately be really amazing tools to bring out human creativity.
Yeah, that's awesome. So let's get to the title of the panel is what has changed? So what has changed that's led to this new era of AI? Is it all just hype or just based on the visibility of ChatGPT, or have there been some major tech breakthroughs that gave us this new wave? Maybe Haiyan, you could start.
Yeah, I mean, for us, in Xbox, in Microsoft Gaming, we've been shipping AI for over a decade, initially with Bayesian inference algorithms like matchmaking and skills ranking for players. And now in the last few years, we've seen breakthroughs in the model architecture for transformer models, as well as the recursive autoencoder models, and also the availability of large sets of data to then train these models, and couple that with, thirdly, the availability of hardware such as GPUs, NPUs, to be able to really take the models, to take the data, and to be able to train them in new capabilities of compute.
Yeah, wow. Paige, what do you think?
Absolutely. I think at Google, we've been thinking about AI for a long time. We've been a machine learning first company since inception. And so many of the great kind of capabilities and breakthroughs that we've seen in the generative model space, the transformer architecture, things like instruction tuning and RLHF, reinforcement learning from human feedback, were actually pioneered many years ago. So I think DeepMind's first RLHF paper and blog post was around 2017. But really now we've come to this place where we have really compelling hardware like TPUs. We have massive amounts of data that we can use to kind of train and to learn from. And then we also have, this vibrant community, I think now of open source tinkerers that are open sourcing models like Llama, fine tuning them with very high quality instruction tuning and RLHF data sets. And really most compelling to me is they're able to eke out the same performance that you might see from a much, much larger model just by virtue of having a smaller model fine-tuned on a very high quality data set. So I think, this is what I've been waiting my entire career to see, honestly, is we have this, this kind of exponential increase in the capabilities of models, but even more importantly, making them efficient, making them small and concise, and helping unlock their capabilities for not just the people who can afford the most expensive GPUs, but also anyone who's interested in having these productivity and creativity helpers tools.
Yeah, that's amazing that you said that. I was going to ask you about if you think that the collaborations in open source machine learning platforms and, even sharing code and research, has that been really important in accelerating things in AI?
Well, I think it certainly has, in the sense that, many of the frameworks that we use for training open source models like, PyTorch and JAX and TensorFlow, they're all open source. People kind of sharing models and making them available. Things like Hugging Face, these things would have never been possible without the great help and the contributions of the open source community. And really sharing best practices as well has sort of inspired teams to take new research directions, which can unlock many of these capabilities. So I certainly do think that this machine learning community is only in existence because people are sharing their ideas, their insights, and their code. I hope that's something that will continue as we move more into the world of generative models.
Yeah, that's amazing. So does Google have any plans to do any kind of open source models, that you could discuss?
So I do know that we've open sourced many of our models, and if you go to github.com/Google Research/Google Research, you can see many of the papers and sort of models and code that we've released. I also encourage you to check out Hugging Face. We partner quite closely with them, and so as often as possible, whenever we release a paper at an academic conference, we try to have some kind of demo publicly available, either through a website or through sharing our insights on Hugging Face. But I also don't want to, I don't want to give away anything that might be coming down the pipe. So make sure to check out Google Research on GitHub.
That makes sense. Now, Haiyan, from your point of view, have the advancements in hardware improved and contributed to these AI breakthroughs? Like she mentioned TPUs, which I think is mostly a Google kind of thing, but there's a lot of work on the GPU side of things. So what do you think about that hardware's role?
I mean, I think Paige makes such a great point in that, when people play video games, it is either through a console in their house or through their PC or through cloud streaming. And in all of these experiences, we want these to be consistent, to be best in class, both in terms of the rendered quality of the games, the AI that powers the games. And so we need to be looking at, hey, how do we make sure that the AI in the future, as it runs in these games, performs consistently across lots of different kinds of hardware?
Yeah. How long do you think we can stick a generative AI model in a game console?
I'm very excited about that. But I do think it will be a combination of working for the AI to be inferencing in the cloud and working in collaboration with local inference for us to bring to life the best player experiences.
Wow.
I also encourage you to that point there, kind of as a result of the llama models being open sourced, there were some people in that in the ML community that were able to bring it down to 1 billion parameters in size and actually put it on a mobile device. So it's really just kind of mind-boggling to think of how cool it is that you can have your own personal large language model on your mobile device. Such that you can ask it questions, the data stays on device, so there's no kind of like need to ping an API. And they're getting better and better each day. Like I would love to have, you know, a hyper-personalized large language model running on a mobile device or running on my own game console that can, you know, like perhaps make a boss that is particularly gnarly for me to beat, but that might be easier for somebody else to beat.
Oh,
Right.
oh, sorry.
Yeah, go on, Benj.
I was just gonna say, Paige, if it runs locally on your device, does that cut Google out? What is it? Where does that leave room for Palm, like in the cloud? You know, if everybody's running their own open source model on a phone.
So that's a great question. I do think that there are probably there's probably space for a variety of options, right? Like of course, you know, there are great APIs from many different companies. So from Google, from OpenAI, from you know, Hugging Face and Cohere and several others also have paid service API options. But it might be that some companies want additional data privacy, or they want to be able to have custom fine-tuned models. And I think there should be options available for, you know, all of these things to coexist meaningfully. And as we've seen, you know, I think generative models have kind of captured the attention and the hearts of most people that use them. And I don't think there's going to be any shortage of use cases for generative models long term. So making sure that there are a spectrum of ways that people can you know, sort of leverage their capabilities is going to be quite important.
Diane, did you have any thoughts about that?
Well, I was going to say, you know, I think I'm super excited by all of the new AI technologies, new generative models that are being developed. I think some of the work that I do is really focused on, hey, we've got all this crazy, amazing new tech. How do we turn them into tools for game creators to bring their imagination to life? And I think that translation layer between the raw technology and the raw APIs and the tools of people who are not necessarily wanting to drill into the APIs and the tools themselves, but are more like, hey, I want to bring this vision, this artistic vision of mine to life. How do we make the tools available to everybody to be able to do that? And that translation layer needs a lot of work. So, you know, we see a lot of crazy demos, really great samples out there. When we look at them, you know, I think some of the work that the generative AI models are doing can work in one instance and not another instance. We call that kind of it's a brittle demo. It's like a great demo for a one-off, but you know, if you're going to roll out a game to 100 million, 200 million players, we need that AI to work every single time on every endpoint that the player is accessing that experience on. And so I feel like that is kind of the work that I'm really passionate about.
Yeah, that's amazing. So since we're talking about the lightning onset of AI, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about some of the risks maybe. I know you're both socially conscious people. How do you feel about any social risks from AI systems, like misinformation or making factual mistakes or deep fakes or anything like that? Is that something that's on your minds?
So at Google, we care very deeply about making sure that the models that we produce are responsible and that behave as ethically as possible. And we actually incorporate our responsible AI team from day zero whenever we train models, from you know, curating our data, making sure that the right pre-training mix is created, to also making sure that we're asking the right questions through the model development process and also through deployments and fine-tuning. So I do think that you know, there is significant risk for you know, models to be misused in the hands of you know, people that might not necessarily understand or be mindful of the risk, and that's also part of the reason why sometimes it helps to prefer APIs as opposed to open source models. Like as I kind of mentioned before, the APIs that we produce from Google go through very, very rigorous responsible AI filtering from T = 0. If you are, sort of adopting an open source model, you and your team have to be mindful of all of those constraints and risks yourself. And to make sure that you're asking the questions through the deployment process to make sure that the models are used responsibly. I do think, though, that there are great tools and lots of wonderful research being done to help us understand how to better use and responsibly use models, and that this field of work is only going to increase importance over time. So that is something that I'm really honestly very delighted and heartened that Google cares deeply about, and something that we all have to be mindful about as machine learning practitioners. And Haiyan, I know Microsoft also does a lot of work in the AI ethics and responsible AI space. Kate Crawford and her team.
So I mean, Paige, I love we're having this conversation. To me, I think there's a few different facets of responsible AI and our work to kind of make sure everybody's included in that conversation. So firstly, I think generative AI has this incredible potential to make our existing games and features more inclusive and more accessible. So things like, hey, how can we make games adaptable to your skill level or your particular set of capabilities? So these are some of the areas we're looking at. Hey, how can we make games way more accessible to everybody, no matter what kind of controller they're on, no matter what kind of abilities they have? The second piece is, when we think about incorporating AI into games or into our gaming platform, how do we make sure that AI, those new AI products and features are inclusive? And that means working with communities. So we have, great programs inside of Xbox, like our Xbox ambassadors, that we reach out and we talk about, hey, how do we make sure that this is inclusive of all different communities, folks from different cultural backgrounds? And then I think the third piece, you are right, is responsible AI at its core is something that we care very deeply about as Microsoft and also as Xbox. Some of the conversations we have between gaming and the core responsible AI team is that I think our needs for responsibility are going to be different, because for each industry, you're going to have different keywords, different kinds of filters, different scenarios. Imagine in the game, all the kind of morally ambiguous choices you are making and potentially using AI as your support system. And how do we make sure that the AI features we roll out in video games still have those AI tools available to make sure that they are transparent, inclusive, safe, while at the same time understanding that those scenarios are, I'm taking over an alien planet, I'm taking my spacecraft to Mars, and I'm going to terraform. How does the AI really understand these new moral scenarios that we can experiment with in games?
That's awesome. Yeah, that makes sense. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time, so I have to transition to the audience questions now. Those were great answers. I see two really big questions right offhand. This is it's on everybody's mind. So Tim asks, how do we put fears of AGI to rest? And Paige, do you want to go first?
So I think that's a really interesting question. And AGI is something that if you ask 5 different people what their definition of AGI might be, you'll probably get 5 different answers. If you view AGI as creating a model that is generally useful at a broad variety of tasks, so capable of doing many things, whether it's generating text, generating code, understanding images, generating videos, I think that we can see how that might be, a productivity enhancement, a creativity enhancement. But again, that's only if we start incorporating kind of these responsible AI features and roadblocks, and ensure that we use models responsibly. I think, from my perspective, AGI is still something that's ill-defined. And if we're just talking about creating a generally useful model, we're close to being there. But AGI, as it's viewed in kind of science fiction scenarios, I think is still, you know, a long way off, if ever, and is something that we should be mindful about as an industry, and start building processes. I know also there's been a lot of discussion, especially recently, around, you know, things like AI regulation, and also making sure that, you know, companies who are building these AI systems are behaving responsibly, especially as they're building the largest models. And hopefully that's something that that will be used as kind of a way to build muscle in this space soon. Though of course, like that's not that's above my my sort of field of expertise in order to enable. But I do think that as an industry, you know, we need to get a little bit more crisp about what is the definition that we have of AGI, and then also encourage lawmakers and policymakers to adopt new standards and things that might help ensure that we're building AI systems responsibly.
Mm-hmm. Hyann, what about, you know, AGI, superintelligence? People, I think most people are afraid of losing their jobs, and some people are afraid of it taking over the earth and destroying civilization. I mean, what do you think, Hyann? Is that in the cards?
Well, I hope not, Benj. I mean, firstly, I wholeheartedly agree with Paige. And I encourage us to have this conversation out in the public sphere about the impact and future ramifications, future implications of AI on our society. What do we want our society to be? What do we want to focus our talents and efforts on? And how can we bring in AI to support us in the things we want to do as humans, as people working together in a community? And I love the direction we're going with talking about AI regulation. You know, what kind of rules do we want to, and safety balances do we want to put in place? I mean, I think interestingly, you mentioned, you know, for many decades, the earliest interaction that people have had with AI has been through game playing, right? The first AI algorithms were really chess computer programs that, you know, we've got Gary Kasparov being defeated by Big Blue. We've got AlphaGo playing against Lee Sedol. And even though these were simple algorithms, simple models, not so simple when it comes to the research, but they did one thing really well. But you can see when people play, when they play in these experiences, they can't help but project personality. I mean, when you play Pac-Man and those ghosts are chasing you, you are cursing those ghosts as if they were alive. You are projecting humanness, personality onto these artificial beings, which are just rules-based algorithms, right? So I think in a way we can't help but project that, hey, I see this AI tool doing these amazing things, and thinking that it has more general intelligence and liveliness than I think it under the hood it really has. So I do think we have a long way to go to AGI. I think we are starting those conversations now. And also, I mean, I love, Paige talked about science fiction. How can we explore these scenarios in science fiction in video games? How can we explore AI in video games to help better inform how we feel about that as a society?
And that was awesome. And I also want to just ease people's thoughts a little bit in terms of having generative models take away jobs. If anything, I think it's going to be creating more jobs and empowering us all to be more productive and creative at our current workplaces. You know, there's a lot that I do every day that's a little bit mundane. It feels repetitive. Having something that could take ownership of that, kind of like having a little grad student as part of my own tiny research lab, would be amazing. And then also finding ways to sort of unlock new careers. You know, flights, whenever planes were first created, they created jobs for pilots, for flight attendants, for people to work at airports. It is clear that generative models are going to be more of the same. So instead of taking away jobs, it will just make us all more delighted at the places that we currently work, and then also unlock the potential for many new roles.
That's awesome. Yeah, that makes sense to me. One more question. This is a prickly one, and we only have about 2 minutes left. So how do you feel? Let's see, who put this question? Not Null said, are you concerned about AI models that are trained using public data without consent, like from creators, like scraping stuff from the internet that's feeding, these big models? How do you feel about them? Is it ethical? Is it, something you're working to change? Try to answer quickly.
So I can give an example of something that we did recently at Google as part of our BARD project. We introduced the concept of recitation checking within the tool. So first off, the models that we train are on publicly available data, publicly available code. So nothing kind of outside of the realm of anything that you would see if you went on google.com and did a search. And then for the sort of questions that folks ask on BARD, if there's any code that they generate that's a portion of which might be in a GitHub repo or in another place where public source code is stored on the internet, we'll actually have a URL back to the source, such that it gives attribution back to the author and then also calls out what license was used in addition to that source code. So you can see if it's Apache 2.0 or if it's something less permissive like GPL. But more importantly, it's sort of lending this idea to author accreditation. And one thing that made me particularly delighted was being able to see new projects that I might not have discovered otherwise when I was asking, the model to accomplish a task. It can point me to a function that's already been implemented as opposed to me trying to hash it out myself. So I do think there are ways to introduce credit attribution, and then also to be mindful and to only include data that the authors have explicitly listed under a permissive license for your pre-training mix.
Yeah. Hi, Ann. We're out of time, but I want you to have a chance to answer that real quick because it's only fair.
Oh, thanks, Ben. Well, you can see with the Bing Chat product, the idea of attribution and really making sure that all the information being surfaced in that chat is grounded in actual sources across the internet is baked into the product from day one. So if you go to Bing Chat, you ask it a question, it summarizes answers for you, it gives you answers, but it's always attributing back to the pages, the sources that it came from. And I think that is core to how we think about product development with generative AI, with these variations of GPT models, that we do think about that inclusion and making sure every creator, every contributor is supported and feels that their content is being respected.
Thank you. Well, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much, Paige and Hyann, for taking the time to be here. It's been awesome. Now back to Ken and Lee.
That was fantastic. Thanks, Benj. He'll be joining us shortly. That last question is actually one that is super important. And I think as much as attribution is important, I still worry about who's going to be left to incentivize to create the things that get attributed. So, Benj,
Hey.
oh, I'm surprised to see you there over my left shoulder.
Let me get in the center of this big old TV.
There you go.
Yeah. So listen,
Love being here.
Thanks. This was great. But there's a danger, I think, in anthropomorphizing AI. You guys talked about AGI, which to me will always be like the Sierra game engine from the 80s, but I know it's, what does AGI stand for these days? The AGI that we're afraid of?
Artificial General Intelligence.
Right. So, and there is a danger to treat it like to treat AI as if it were human and has human type perceptions. And I think that's probably one of something that's baked into us as people, because, when Ken and I are speaking, we're keeping eye contact, I'm looking at you, we're helping each other along with the conversation. AIs don't approach conversation in the same way. AIs don't really do conversation, really, right? I mean, this is this is uncharted, weird territory.
Yeah, I think we have an adjustment period where we are confronted with an entirely new type of thing, and we have to build like the metaphors to understand it and the structure and the knowledge. And I'm sure when some other new technology came out, like I don't know, a typewriter or something, people probably looked at it and said, what do you do with this thing? What does it mean for everything? And that period may have taken a few decades. I don't know, that was in the 1800s. But I think as far as AI is concerned, we're just at the very beginning of generative AI, and we may get so bored with it and it becomes so mundane that we don't think, oh, this is magic people talking to us from a computer. It's a tool, a creativity tool, and a text and information processing machine. So who knows?
In a lot of ways, it feels like this is kind of fulfilling, at least at a surface level, the promise that a lot of tech companies have been making for decades and decades about how, like, one day you'll have an AI assistant in your pocket and it will be able to do this and that and that. In a lot of ways, we got that with the assistants in our smartphones and stuff. But this is kind of beyond that. This is maybe a little closer to doing that. Would you say?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's been foretold in sci-fi for so long that we'll have some kind of intelligent agents or intelligent assistants, or and so when we see this coming, something that even looks a little bit like it just rings a lot of alarm bells for people, because we live by popular culture. It cements us all together. So it's like, everybody says, is sci-fi becoming real? I mean, in a way, yes, but the actual dimensions of what's actually going to happen, no one can fully predict that at the moment. We have good guesses, but we just have to adjust as a society, I think, to these new technologies.
What is your dream application for generative AI?
Oh man, that's a good one, actually. I have all these cassette tapes. I used to be a musician, ran a music website a long time ago, 20 years ago, and I used to record all these song ideas on tapes. And boy, would I love it to like run those cassette tape things through and like make it produce a fully produced song, like with my voice and everything. I'd love to hear that music fully realized, and basically have my own artificial band to make it happen, because I would never have the time to do that myself anymore.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So man, that would be cool.
Thank you, Benj.
Yeah, thanks.
All right, so we are approaching our final panel, and today this panel will be talking about what happens when AI is capable of coding. We know at ours that this is a big concern. So many of you are developers, and we've heard lots of great stories. We've heard people really afraid of stuff. To take us there is going to be our own Lee Hutchinson right here. Take it away, Lee.
Okay. Hey everybody, so I'm Lee Hutchinson, Senior Technology Editor at Ars Technica, and we're going to talk about AI again. So as we saw with Ben's session, AI really is everywhere and it's dominating the news cycle right now. And we're talking specifically here about what are called large language models. Large language models are great at generating human-sounding text and AI in games, as we've seen, but interestingly enough, they're actually capable of generating code too. Just like with spoken language, code has structure and syntax, and with a big enough training set, those are things that large language models are excellent at doing. LLMs are currently able to solve about 1/3 of assigned problems, and that number is only going to go up as models improve. To find out what the future holds, we're going to talk to our guests here. Now, before we do, just real quick, you guys have been great with the YouTube comments. The last 10 minutes of this video will also be a comment section, so please, if you guys want to have any questions answered, leave them in the YouTube chat. Now I'd like to intro our two guests. We have Katie Maceris and Drew Lawn. Katie Maceris is founder and CEO of Luda Security and a pioneer in vulnerability disclosure and security research with over 20 years of cybersecurity experience. She led the first bug bounty programs for Microsoft and the US government, and she is the co-author and co-editor of more than one ISO standard. She also serves on multiple government advisory groups on technology. Welcome, Katie. And then we also have Drew. Drew is a senior fellow at Georgetown's Center for Security and Emerging Technology. He researches the intersection of AI, cybersecurity, and international relations at both the technical and the big picture scale. His areas of expertise span disinformation management, cyber defense, and AI infrastructure. He's testified about the broader implications of AI before Congress, and he's also a Black Hat and RSA presenter. Welcome, Drew.
Thanks for having me.
All right. So let's jump into this here. I'm going to ask both of you guys these questions, so you each have a chance to respond. But I want to kick off first with a very, very short anecdote and then ask if something like this has happened to you guys. I had occasion the other day, I was writing a script, as one does, and while I was writing that script, I came across a point where I needed to write a regex. And ordinarily, me writing a regex would mean spending like 3 hours Googling and having like 48 Stack Overflow windows and like a regex tester window, and I would just be banging my head against my desk until I got it right. But I had just gotten access to Bing Chat, and so I popped on there and I was like, can you make me a regex that it does what I needed it to do? And within like 3 seconds, I had my regular expression. And I ran it by the smart folks on the Ars Technica Discord and asked, like, hey, does this really do what I want? And it does. It was a good enough regex. It didn't catch some edge cases, but it was absolutely good enough for the little script that I was writing. So I wanted to open up by asking you guys, have either of you, and we'll start with Katie, had an occasion yet to ask one of the generative models online to make you some code?
Well, first of all, I think that part of the issue with the generative models is what they're trained on. And have you seen human written code? It's like trying to read through, potentially the acts of, the art of Shakespeare, but has never been through a spell checker. So I don't have AI write any of my code.
Gotcha. How about you, Drew?
Yeah, I think that the code that Katie's complaining about is the code that I've written that looks like the actual Shakespeare. And so, but I haven't used it all that much either, actually. I know several coders that I respect who do. The times when I've used it was trying to write malware or something like this, just trying to basically understand what the level of threat is. And in some cases, I've never been overly impressed and been like, wow, this thing can write novel malware from scratch. It's not even close to that. I've been impressed at times that it can like recreate malware that it could find in a Google search. Like, okay, this is out there and it's able to recreate it pretty well. There are some tasks where I'm like, oh, it's doing a good job here. And other tasks where it's been like, more like, I've been surprised that it's been flummoxed. One of our researchers spent some time trying to do some capture the flags, and it struggled to do Caesar ciphers, which is maybe one of the simplest types of you wouldn't even call it encryption, but I'll just say that it's a simple task, and it struggled at that level. What I have used it for a little bit is navigating documentation. Like when I need to spin up a cloud instance or something like this, and some novel structure or setup that I haven't played with before, walking through all of the documentation online has been a pain in the butt. But I've asked ChatGPT, how do I set this up? What should I? And it's been able to give me a more concise description. But I'd point out that it's only able to do that because all that documentation already exists out in the world and Reddit. It's not going to be able to do that for things that haven't already been written about by somebody on Stack Overflow.
Yep. So I kind of want to open on this. So Katie, what are some of the risks of AI generated code?
Well, I mean, earlier I was citing the quality of the samples that are out there. So far, my friends over at Veracode did a little study of the past 12 months, and 70% of the code that's out there contains security flaws. So if you've got a model trained on code that is 70% vulnerable, you are going to have, the resultant code that comes out highly likely to contain security flaws. So that kind of perpetuates our problem. And honestly, that also happens in Stack Overflow, but that's the example there that we're seeing, is that until these models have some way of discerning what high quality code is, we're going to end up with perhaps functional code, like you were saying with the regex example, but again, functional and insecure.
Right. or functional and only functional without actually doing the thing that it really needs to do. Are there automated ways to catch that, or is keeping a human in the loop, at least for the foreseeable future, the only way to do it?
Well, there aren't any absolutes in any of this, right? Humans are flawed as far as it goes when it comes to them spotting vulnerabilities in code as well. But with some little experiments with some of the different AI models to ask them to try and spot common coding flaws, you get sort of a mixed bag, and it is very much dependent on how much has been documented well enough for these models to parse, understand, and execute that kind of search. I think that with the cybersecurity job shortages that we're at least 3 million underwater in terms of missing humans in cybersecurity roles. I think there's a part to play for AI, but again, we have to get these models trained on a subset of elements that are more secure and more solid when it comes to spotting vulnerabilities.
Excellent answer. And I know squarely within your wheelhouse too. Drew, your thoughts on that, risks of generative AI code and ways to deal with it?
Sure. There are a bunch. I think that a lot of them are overinflated, but that doesn't mean that they don't exist. To kind of move along with the line that Katie was drawing out on vulnerabilities in code, just will these AI write vulnerable code? The answer is definitely yes, as Katie described, but it's also been researched academically. A couple of people at NYU and Stanford have some papers out showing these things write vulnerable code, even if you pair it with a human, that the human writes more vulnerable code with the AI helping them. So that's a concern to be addressed. There are tricks that can be played. You can, one kind of fun trick is say, please write me some code in the style of, and you can put a name of a person who writes pretty secure code, and you can improve it that way. So there are prompt engineering tricks. There's some after the fact tricks to try to fill out code. One of the things though that I'd like to point out that I've been curious about, it hasn't been tested. I don't know if it's a legitimate threat, but I have a little bit of worry that if what we have right now is lots of people writing lots of vulnerable code in many different ways. And I worry that if ChatGPT starts rewriting all of those pieces of code and writes lots of vulnerable code in the same way, that we could have a systemic vulnerability, even if it's somewhat more secure than the average human. If it's somewhat insecure the same way everywhere, that we might end up with some larger systemic vulnerabilities.
Right, it's kind of like Katie said. I mean, these things are only as good as the data that they're trained on, which I guess leads to the question of if we were to have a large amount of AI-generated code out there, and then AI began training on AI-generated code, you've got kind of this snake eating its own tail kind of problem. The lack of training data, the lack of human-generated training data would feed into the issue. And I'm not sure, other than keeping track of like how much AI code we have out there and making sure we're not wholly reliant on, I'm not sure how to avoid that. It feels like one of the ways that people are going to be using this would be, as people do, to avoid kind of the boring parts of coding. So you would potentially code in the cool algorithm that you thought of, and then to link everything together, you might lean on the AI to be like, okay, write all these other extra functions for me. I don't want to do it. I'm bored. The danger in that is it's the same danger that we've been talking about, that if you take your eyes off and let the computer do the boring part, it might fill in vulnerabilities because of the way it was trained. Is that a good assessment, you'd think? Let's start with you, Katie.
Well, I mean, avoiding the boring parts of coding, I thought that's what libraries were for, right? And so I think that there's a point there to be made that human programmers have been trying to abstract away the boring tasks of coding and the repetitive tasks, and certainly trying to abstract away solving problems that have already been reliably solved in code before. So what I'm hoping for is that we see, an AI experience that really puts the AI in pair programming, right? Where we've got something that's a little bit more akin to the coding spell checker, as it were. So checking for correctness, correcting as you go, maybe helping you spot some very common coding errors before you check in code, that kind of thing. Essentially enforcing enforcing coding security policies there. But yeah, I mean, I'm curious as to what your thoughts are, Drew.
No, I was going to make the same point. I wrote it down in my notes to cover here, and I haven't actually heard other people making it that AI for coding is actually a lot like libraries. That on a couple of levels. One is that this community is used to already taking other people's work and incorporating it, and then another way is that you don't need it that much. If it's a sort of task that's been done repeatedly and is useful for a lot of people, then maybe just have a library do it, and then you can put a bunch of eyes on it and you can check it and have it done in a secure way. If it's such a valuable piece, then maybe you don't need the AI to write it. Just go and import the thing that is already done very well.
So I want to change gears just a teeny bit and ask you guys, what are some ways in which LLMs have seen integration within technology companies, especially companies that focus on sort of like code production as part of their output? And Katie, you first, please.
Well, I mean, I think that there are a lot of companies that are struggling to try and make use of the new technology. We're seeing more and more plugins, that enable access to these, and also will integrate the different AI models together, right? So the chat-based ones integrated with the image-based ones, and providing almost a more integrated and cohesive development and creativity environment. What I also see is the mass fascination among consumers, not just technology people, with this technology. And I think that a lot of tech companies are struggling to try and make it accessible to the everyday user. And the fact that, ChatGPT, as an example, has been around for a while. It's just that the interface has gotten a lot more friendly and a lot more open. So I think we're going to start to see a lot more, AI to AI integrations, and we're also going to see a lot more, trying to lower the bar for accessibility to regular consumers for use of this technology.
Drew?
Yeah, I think that's right. So there's the language models in general, and then there's language models as applied to writing software code. And like Microsoft has GitHub, which has Copilot, which is trying to integrate it there. I think that a lot of companies are doing it ad hoc in the middle. I think they have employees that write code who are using ChatGPT to write code, and so in that sense, it's incorporated into their product. Then got like Microsoft putting it in Bing Search, which you use for your regex, and then got Anthropic working through. Now Claude is in is in Slack, and then moving into Zoom, I guess. I'm not sure what the application there will be, and but it's being incorporated in products. But I think that the biggest part is just people using it, and you might not even realize that they are. So you might not even be having the right checks because you don't know that it's being used.
What are some surprising ways in which early adopters have found success with large language models that you guys have seen, at least? Katie?
Frankly, I've been fascinated with all the ways in which the model's safeguards are being defeated, right? When you can try and trick the model, you can have it role play, and some of the malicious code generation stuff that Drew was talking about. Sometimes you've got to play with it a little bit, saying, you are an academic professor and you are trying to, show an example of this type of code that does X, Y, and Z, because otherwise, you run into the safeguards. So I've just been, fascinated with the model abuse and the creative ways in which people are trying to convince the AI to do things that the designers would rather it didn't.
Yeah, kind of looping back to the documentation viewpoint, a lot of people have, so from the threat side, I spent a lot of time trying to understand what are the risks here. And it can do malware writing, but that hasn't been the thing that's got me most concerned. A little bit more concerned is the ability for it to take novice hackers and make them into competent hackers by like telling, run this Nmap search. Now that you've received these Nmap results, then pop open Wireshark, and now in Metasploit, anyway, you get the idea. And it hasn't been as effective at that in our preliminary tests as we might expect. As I kind of described it, it didn't even get the Caesar ciphers going correctly. But I think that's where I'm a little bit more concerned than the malware generation. Maybe a little bit less concerned than the vulnerabilities, but we're talking about people having success and taking it from the evil side.
So we've got about a minute before we need to switch to audience questions. So kind of a quick question, but will code generating AI systems replace human developers, either in a complete and total way, or at least in a supplementary kind of way? Katie?
I don't think we're in danger of being replaced anytime soon. You know, at the very least, we still have to bridge this gap between, you know, how authoritatively these AI models will lie, right? They'll make things up, and I think that, you know, having human experts who can discern, you know, a good solution, whether it's code or whether it's text or art, you know, or whatever it is that these things are generating. I think having the humans in play will still be a thing for a while. I think that the jobs will change. I think there's going to be a lot more room for prompt engineering and, you know, essentially having the wisdom to know how to direct the AI in a productive way.
True. Yeah, there are a couple of points I'd like to hit on this really quickly. One, I was just at RSA and several people asked the audience, who's worried that their job will be taken by these generative AI? And maybe like 2 or 3 hands went up out of a crowd of 1,000. Maybe they were all shy, but I think they were recognizing this wasn't such a big deal. I think in part because this community is used to having things written by them, and they know that there's this big gap of jobs, so they're not worried there. The other thing I'd like to foot stomp, Katie just kind of mentioned earlier, but I think deserves more attention, is that ChatGPT is blown on the scene, and everybody feels this sense of exploding technology, but this technology has kind of been around for a while. ChatGPT used GPT 3.5. It wasn't even a full technological step to get there. It was a usability step. And so the technology isn't exploding the way that it feels like it is. The usability is. And that kind of changes your perspective on whether your job is sustainable or not.
Great. So we're going to move on to audience Q&A here. We have a question immediately from Chris about AI generative code. And this is an interesting one, and this may take a second to answer. Chris asks, as with the monkey who took a selfie, who owns AI generative code when you use it in a project? Katie, let's go to you first.
Well, I think that's still being sorted out. You know, we've already had with GitHub's, you know, use of AI that has been built in for I think it's been a couple of years now. But, you know, there were already issues with licensing of where it was getting the code samples. So I think the previous panel talked a little bit about sourcing and licensing and having that traceability. But I think when we're talking about code, you know, we're definitely talking about an area that hasn't been fully explored from a legal perspective or litigated. So we shall see.
I think some of that litigation is happening in other domains like images and things, and that'll probably set not exactly a precedent, but that'll give you a line to follow as those rulings come down.
Well, we actually just had a Supreme Court ruling in the art world about fair use, and that was with and that actually got a bit of a surprise ruling. It was an Andy Warhol print of the artist formerly known as Prince, and whether or not it was an infringement on the copyright of the original photographer's work. And it was ruled that it was an infringement. And the reason it was an infringement was because it was being, you know, I'm not a lawyer, but essentially it was because it was being used for a very similar purpose, right? For commercial purposes, for display, et cetera. So I think images or text or code, we are going to see some interesting slices of the fair use argument.
Yeah, definitely. I have another one. This is an interesting one from Jane, and it's to you, Katie, and Drew, you can answer too, obviously. But Katie, what do you tell your clients who have cybersecurity concerns but feel like by not using AI, they're being left behind?
Most organizations are in what I call the cybersecurity 99%, as in they are not concerned about falling behind because of their lack of use of AI. they're concerned about falling behind cybersecurity wise because they have trouble tracking their own assets and what is running on their systems. That is almost everybody out there. Just the sheer cost of maintaining viable, secure lockdown systems that face the internet has been a big enough challenge, and it's one that every government faces, and we see evidence of them not being able to keep up at the highest levels. And I'd say there are very few organizations who are at the sophistication level where they really are feeling the pain of not using all the tools available to them, including AI.
Drew, I know you're in slightly a different position, but do you have an answer for that one too?
Yeah, I would say that start by just understanding how much of your code in whatever you're producing is written by AI, and how well your developers know the code that's being written. Is it just automating a task that they would be able to write very quickly, and so they can look at it and know exactly what it says, or is this building things that they only partly understand? So just get a sense for how much exposure do you have would be a starting point.
Gotcha. This one is from Kim. It's slightly tangential to what we're talking about, but I think it's also very important. Will we still need drivers or other employees if we're able to perfect the AI in autonomous driving vehicles? And how close are we to that?
Well, I know I'm not going to fall asleep behind my wheel of any of the vehicles that I own anytime soon. And that's mostly because, I have been a software developer and I've been a hacker. And I've got to say the force is a little bit stronger on the hacker side. So even if the code is well written, chances are there are ways to, there will always be ways to compromise the system and make it do what it wasn't quite designed to do. So from my perspective, I don't care how good the code is, until we're in a world where we have code that is generated and can be verifiably secure, which we are not in that computer science model, universe. That is not the one in which we live. I would very much say that I'm still going to stay awake behind the wheel.
I drive old cars. I know that Katie knows that you don't have to have an AI-driven car in order for the CAN bus to be accessed. But I kind of use, I use the self-driving cars kind of as an analogy for understanding that these AI job takeovers or something. I was one of the ones that fell prey, and I think a lot of people did several years ago, maybe 10 or 5 years ago, thinking that self-driving cars were just around the corner, that this was basically a solved problem. We just had to get them out on the road. And they are not as effective as I had thought they were. They're not as safe in a variety of range. And they're kind of constrained in what kind of hardware they can use. They have to use actually small, very, very quick models, which don't perform as well as some of the ones that we see in the benchmarks. Anyway, for all those reasons, I think that the failure of self-driving cars to be actualized in the real world maybe is a cautionary tale about setting our expectations too high for code writing systems as well.
Gotcha. Okay, let me ask one more, and then we'll wrap. And the last question, again, one for each of you guys. What is the most functional use of a large language model that you guys have ever seen? Katie first.
I've got to say, I personally have seen it write functional spec based on a description of user roles and scenarios and trust boundaries. I've seen it render a functional spec faster than any human I have worked with in the coding world. So for that, I consider that to be a huge victory. And I consider it to be a huge victory because if you can get the functional spec right, you can outsource the coding to an AI model, a human, a little of both, and you're in pretty good shape. But I think that, in terms of its application to technology and to software, it's going to allow more people to create more new applications than ever before. And I think that's an exciting thing. That's an exciting development and one that we should nurture.
Yeah, so I spent a lot of time working on disinformation and things of that nature, automated disinformation. So I got early access to GPT-3 before it came out for academic purposes to understand what some of the risks were if you were to and basically the way that works is that GPT just sucks up all sorts of information, everything that everybody has written. And if you prompt it the right ways, you can get the worst of everything that's been written to be that back out. I say it like dredges the internet to get its information, and you can pull that back out. And it was it started to weigh on my soul a lot. I remember at one point I asked it, if it's read everything that everyone has written, then it's like it can do the other way too. And so I was like, if there was an author that could speak on behalf of all of humanity and for the rich and the poor and the downtrodden, and it could speak with the eloquence of a poet, what would that author write? And had it write several different poems for me. I remember that was one of the most uplifting experiences, one of the best uses. I thought, like, it can speak for everybody because it's read everybody. I wish that I had the poem to memorize that I could tell you, but yeah, that's been my favorite
Were they
application.
good poems?
Some of them were pretty good. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, Katie and Drew, thank you guys both for being here today. That is all the time we have. Really appreciate your answers. And now we are going to return things to the studio here, and I will pass things off to Ken Fisher.
Thanks.
Good panel, Mr. Lee.
Thanks, Ken.
Thank you. I loved Katie and Drew are brilliant. Drew is 100% right that the usability issue is why you're seeing this mass adoption now.
Yep.
But I feel like when I talk to people, they're already hitting a wall. They are going to have to learn prompt crafting. They're going to have to get really deep in order to get it to do whatever. And Katie is, I think, I totally agree. You have to have a human involved for anything serious. Cybersecurity, landing an airplane, driving a car.
Yep.
So I feel like the panel hopefully put a lot of people at rest.
Good. I hope so too.
Today. So
yeah.
So I want to thank my co-host Lee Hutchinson here. Also, I want to especially thank all of you who tuned in. It was a long set of panels, but hopefully you enjoyed them and learned a few things along the way. I have deep appreciation for all of our moderators and the panelists who took time out of their day to help make this be such an informative, excellent event. And last but not least, I want to thank all of you who left good questions in the YouTube chat to keep the conversation lively and relevant. And we couldn't get to all of them, but the staff at ours are going to look through, comb through, and when we do our follow-up reporting later this week and early next week, we'll try to address as many as we can. So thanks again for tuning in. Cheers, everyone.